All right, so what's next for nuclear power? If you guys are here today, you probably are interested in at some level in like what is nuclear, and probably if you're really here, it's what is nuclear as part of the future of climate change and our ability to address that. So I am here to kind of talk about that. And really what I'm here to do, or why I'm here, is because I believe nuclear power enables us to fight climate change. There are a lot of nuclear advocates out there. You can go on YouTube and type why nuclear. There's lots of people who, you don't need a nuclear engineering degree to understand why and talk about what it means. I think most of those people are probably better than me in terms of really advocating for nuclear power. I'm here because I believe in understanding the technology without hyper fear mongering. So I'm not here to tell you why nuclear is perfect, and I'm not here to tell you why nuclear will kill all of you. Somewhere in the middle is the reality of nuclear. And I thought people would be interested in understanding a little bit about more of the technology to get there. And then I'm a huge nerd. So talking about something that I've nerded out for way too long in my life is just brings a deep nerdy pleasure to me. So, you know, my background is in nuclear engineering, and like, there's probably some things I would like, but not a whole lot I'd like more than to really just spend the next hour going through every obscure nuclear topic I could think of, including this slide, which, you know, can talk about a whole bunch of nuclear physics just going through, but we're gonna come back to this slide. So if you're really excited to understand what's on here, we'll touch on it briefly. But you know, I kind of wanted to just paint a picture of like why nuclear exists, why I care about it in terms of climate change, and what the technology looks like today around the world, and then what are the options going forward, and how do they work. So let's see, is it worth it for me to keep the chat open? Okay, I will do that. Just trying to get a sense of how to do this. Apologize, this is my first webinar, or whatever this is. Okay, so just kind of getting off the bat, like why don't people like nuclear, right? If you go back to the 60s, nuclear power is going to be too cheap to meter. All of our power was going to be coming from nuclear, and like obviously the world's in a very different place today. There are, you know, real issues with nuclear power. There's safety concerns. There's nuclear waste. It's expensive. Uranium mining is problematic, and proliferation is something a lot of people are concerned about. I think fundamentally, like, and you know, fundamentally that. I believe that the problems that we face in terms of climate change are bigger than our ability to solve any of these problems, but that doesn't mean that we get to, you know, ignore these things. It's a privilege to trust, and you know, I'm in a very privileged position in society. It's a privilege to trust the nuclear engineers and, you know, leaders and people who are responsible for making these decisions will make a decision that impacts everyone in a way that's best for everyone. You know, and when you're concerned with like how the government will deal with nuclear waste, or how safe is safe enough, you know, you're trusting that a bunch of largely white male nuclear engineers and politicians are like, well, here's the cost of this thing, here's the cost of that thing, here's how this impacts this community. Historically speaking, that's like not been a really good thing, especially if you're not another white man. So like, I think in that whole context, we have to be cognizant of what it means to talk about safety. But all that being said, you know, I fundamentally believe that these problems are solvable, but only if we address them and care about them. So I'm not going to kind of talk too much about that. Obviously, we have time in the Q&A for what specifically we do about safety or nuclear waste or cost or whatever. But yeah. So why nuclear? I think, you know, there's a lot of reasons why, and people are, you know, there's a whole bunch of different things, whether it's grid stability or low carbon or whatever. I think, you know, someone said it better than me, which is the proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences. So I'm just going to read this verbatim. It should be a source of profound concern for all who care about climate change that for entirely predictable and resolvable reasons, without immediate and profound changes, we appear to be set to lose one of the most promising candidates for providing a wedge of reliable, low carbon energy over the next few decades, and perhaps even the rest of the century. And that's really the context of where we are, especially in the US, but then also in most of the world. So why did they write that? Why did they say that nuclear power is, you know, so critical to reaching a decarbonized energy grid? Well, so this is a picture that made the rounds a couple of years ago, or this picture didn't, but this news story did. This was Germany's first day of getting 100% of their energy demand with renewables. So this was a 15-minute window in January of 2018, where basically between a very windy day and some solar, that Germany reached 100% renewables, and it was about for 15 minutes. So the last time I gave a talk similar to this, I just went back to this website, which is energycharts.de, and I was like, let me pull up the last, you know, 24 hours, and this was, or probably more than 20, probably a couple days. But yeah, you can see that right, everyone talks about this with wind and sun, they're variable, but really when we talk about the energy grid, we're talking about providing power sustainably and consistently across a large period of time. And that's where just solar and wind, because they're variable, struggle. So there's batteries, there's demand response, there's all kinds of technologies that people look at, grid transmission, to address those problems. It's energy-charts.de. So there's all kinds of, and that's Germany's energy mix. There's all kinds of ways to solve this problem, and often people look to nuclear as one of them, and people really talk about baseload. So if you look at this chart, this pink line is sort of the hourly demand variation in energy, and you can see that it never really drops below a certain point. And so the very brief argument, which I'm just gonna lay out, is like, why would you produce a highly variable electricity source and then store enough to flatten those peaks if you can produce a base load that's consistent and then only store enough energy for those peaks? It's a much smaller amount of energy that you need to store, and storage is, well, lots of people say is getting cheaper. It's still pretty expensive if you've tried to buy a lithium battery anytime soon. So that's sort of the fundamental reason. This could be like a 2-hour-long lecture, and not having talked about nuclear in a few months, I probably either went through that a little quick or didn't say that as eloquently as I used to. So I think we can come back to that, and there's plenty of time in the questions to really dig into some of that. And Oya, for some of this stuff, probably knows about it better than I do. So, the fundamental question we try and ask, when I choose to work on nuclear and when I chose to get my PhD in nuclear is how do we decarbonize a world built by carbon? So nuclear power comes with inherent risks, challenges, and costs, but tackling climate change requires us to make hard choices. So nothing gets looked at in a vacuum. What is the risk of a nuclear accident? What is the risk of improperly dealing with nuclear waste? What is the reality of the climate change that we're dealing with? And what are the options to decarbonize? That's the context in which myself and many other people come to the answer that nuclear power is the answer. It has to be there. So there's the market cost versus societal cost, and where do we choose to include, pollution versus energy costs and natural gas prices. And it really comes down to, like, there aren't a lot of options for reliable low carbon energy. People talk about the need for reliable low carbon energy and how that decarbonizes the grid cost effectively and whatever. And when you look at it, it's what are they? It's biomass, nuclear, pumped hydro. I'm probably skipping one or two, but carbon sequestration with natural gas or coal. Those are probably the top four. I'm sure I skipped one. And batteries and batteries are getting cheaper, grid flexibility. This isn't the part that you came to hear. This is the part that I need to talk about in terms of the context of why we're doing this. So fundamentally, my perspective is there are absolutely issues with nuclear, and that doesn't mean we just give up on it. It means that we have to solve those and find a way to make it work. Okay, so I'll pause there, even though that's probably the most contentious portion that has the most questions. And yeah, any questions about anything I said? I'll pause there for a couple minutes.
And if people are excited to get into the nuclear engineering,
yeah, I know that wasn't the best part. Cool. Well, I'll just keep running then. So, when I talk about nuclear in the U.S. specifically, Palo Verde is sort of a good proxy for what nuclear can be in the U.S. It was one of the last nuclear power plants built. It currently provides about 35% of Arizona's power, not just their clean power, renewable power, but 35% of their power overall. It's the largest power plant in the world, not located next to a body of water. I just think that's so interesting. I was driving across Arizona one time and I was like, what is that huge plume of steam? And all of the water to cool Palo Verde comes from the sewage from Phoenix. So that's kind of cool. Yeah, so you get these huge plumes of steam that's treated sewage water. It supplies 79% of sunny Arizona's low carbon energy. And that's really just speaks to the power of what 6 gigawatts of energy looks like. There's a company doing battery storage to do virtual power plants in California. I won't necessarily say the name, but I was listening to a CEO talk and they were like, in the entire history of our production, we've, offset 2 gigawatt hours of emissions. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. That's what Diablo Canyon does every hour. So, nuclear power plants just produce a lot of power in a very small footprint. And when you're talking about gigawatts, and gigawatt hours, that's sort of a meaningful chunk of carbon emissions. and just, in terms of like what replaces it. So even if you get to 50% renewable, so 50% solar, as long as that backup comes from natural gas, so what's doing the load following? If that's natural gas, switching to that reality, so shutting down Palo Verde, going to a 50% RPS plus natural gas, according to one analysis, it basically resulted in a CO2 increase of 2.8 million cars on the road. So that's going from like the 5% solar currently to 50% solar. You're like, wow, that's great. But if you're offsetting the natural gas, or you're offsetting the nuclear with natural gas, then you end up burning a lot more CO2. And then, in terms of cost, it was actually pretty economical to build. It was one of the cheapest per kilowatt installed power plants built in the US. It was done for about $3,600 a kilowatt installed. And then the forward operating cost, so what that costs to go forward, not including the construction, just what it costs to keep running, is about 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's also one of the cheapest power plants in the country. It has a capacity factor of more than 95%, which means that at any given hour, there's a 95% chance that Palo Verde is running, which is also pretty high, both for nuclear plants and then power plants in general. I kind of threw this slide in here. I think it used to be later, but I think it's like so important when we talk about what does it mean to, run a grid with nuclear, and what does waste really mean in that context. So this is 2 images from Google satellite photos. On the left is Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant in California. And in this red box is all of the waste that's ever been put in dry cask storage from Diablo Canyon. So that's all of the spent fuel, all of the waste is in dry cask storage. I think they still have a fair amount in wet storage, so it's not all the waste they've ever produced, but it's all the waste that's kind of moved out of that storage into this long-term. This is like probably the plan for the next 150 years until we do something more permanent. So that's all of this waste in this box. And if you assume that Diablo Canyon was powering all of California, so let's say you had, I think you need something like 10 more of those to power, or 15 more of those to power all of California, they would fill up this pad, so what's left on there, about every year. So every year, this pad would fill up. So this would be 2019, and then 2020 would be right here. Okay, and that's all of California's power. No gas, no coal, no solar, no wind, no anything else, no batteries. That's the waste that would get produced. On the right is the largest power plant in Georgia. It's a coal power plant, the Robert Scherer power plant. This thing is sort of cool from an engineering feat. When I started looking into it, there's a train that runs over the coal bed. It doesn't slow down. At any given moment, there's 11 miles of coal trains running back and forth between Wyoming and Georgia carrying the coal for this power plant. This is the coal bed. If this power plant was, duplicated so-and-so to power all of California, this coal bed would be about 6 hours of power. So again, this 1 year, actually, I think just what's in the box is 1 year, not the whole pad. Just what's in the box is 1 year. Not that that's like a huge difference. And this is 6 hours. And again, there is no dry cask storage for the Robert Scherer power plant. Everyone take a deep breath. You are breathing the storage for the Robert Scherer power plant. So that's just like the binary reality of what it means to track and store all of your waste versus storing it in the atmosphere. So, what is nuclear power in the US today? So renewables and nuclear power are roughly tied. I was trying to find like the most up-to-the-minute data. It seems like renewables and nuclear crossed sometime late in 2019, but that's still about 12%, it's about 7% hydro and then 12% non-hydro renewables, and then 20% nuclear. So that's sort of the, when you think about things that don't emit significant carbon, I think the low carbon term is sort of accounts for the life cycle. So from a life cycle perspective, the most analysis has shown, including the IPCC, that from a life cycle perspective, the carbon intensity of nuclear is roughly on par with onshore wind, and a little bit lower than solar. So that's like including uranium mining, concrete, whatever, just because of how long the power plants last, how long that construction is amortized over, and then as well, how much power they produce. But right now, power plants in the US are under strong market pressures, from extremely low cost natural gas and renewables changing how energy markets compensate nuclear power plants, which don't change their load very frequently. Kind of go into that in a second, but there's basically a physics reasons and a capital reason. So from a physics perspective, it's really hard to change nuclear power plants' power level, and we can talk about that. But then from a capital perspective, the fuel cost is basically zero. So the plant costs the same to run whether it's producing 100 and 0, and that's really what makes it hard to deal with variable electricity prices or electricity demand. Right now, anyway, going back to the current state, right now, nuclear reactors are trying to push out to 60 or 80 years. And in general, those life cycle extensions are about the cheapest, most reliable, low carbon electricity we can buy. Some power plants are a little bit more expensive. And so we've started to see reactors shut down, even that are like perfectly well run with no maintenance issues. Just paying the site security cost more than they can make on power markets. Let me just pause and look at the questions. Yeah, I'll come back to those later. So a couple states recently have incentivized their nuclear power plants. So New York and Illinois passed zero emissions tax credits to basically recognize the nuclear power plants in the state. Ohio tried to do something similar, which was a little bit weird with a political compromise and ended up also incentivizing coal. And that got shut down. So there's still some uncertainty about Ohio's nuclear power plants. I just updated the slide. It went from 99 and 6 to 98 and 7 because yesterday Indian Point nuclear power plant in New York shut down. There's one remaining reactor in New York, I believe. I have not updated this last slide. 4 reactors / really 2 are under construction, Vogtle and Summer. So the US's like nuclear renaissance started in 2010 and ended in March of 2011. With Fukushima, and yeah, these reactors have been on the planning board since roughly 1994. The construction started in the early 2000s and has not gone exactly according to plan, both due to safety changes made after Fukushima, and then as well just basically the US hadn't really tried to build a nuclear reactor since, I want to say, the very early 90s, and a lot of the workforce wasn't really up to speed on what was required to do nuclear development in the US. They also were like, we're going to make this great licensing program. So this whole system changed about how we license nuclear power plants, which hopefully can be better, but did not work the first time. I think international markets is where there's a lot more interesting stuff going on nuclear. So outside the US, new reactors are under construction in the UAE. Their first reactor did fuel loading last month, so March 20th. Actually, the first time I gave a similar talk, I was like, and it's going to start up in 4 weeks. And then 3 weeks before they were going to start up, they were like, actually, we're announcing a year of delays. And I was like, you knew that more than 3 weeks before you're starting, that you were going to be a year behind schedule. But that is, it's going, and there's a whole interesting thing going on. But basically, South Korea, probably outside of China and Russia, have become one of the best reactor builders in the world. They sold 4 reactors to UAE, and then their government decided to shut down their entire nuclear industry. So yeah, they're going to keep building the reactors that were under construction, but I haven't heard anything recently that the plan was to basically shutter their entire nuclear industry from the construction side, not the operation side. So basically not building any more reactors domestically. There's a lot of countries, especially Middle East and Asia, Africa, that are, especially those that don't have access to gas supplies, that are turning to nuclear power because it's, they see it as better than importing natural gas, either through liquid natural gas or pipelines. And Russia has really kind of, probably a little bit more so than China, seen reactors as a political tool. So it's one thing to build a gas pipeline to a country, but you can only build a gas pipeline to a country you can build a pipeline to. But you can build a nuclear reactor anyway and anywhere. And the way they do it is not sort of like an in-country model. So it's called build, own, operate. So Russia promises to build the plant, they'll own the plant, they'll operate the plant, and sell you power. And as long as you're in Russia's good graces, there's nothing wrong with that. And I can't imagine anyone ever doing anything to get out of Russia's good graces. And so there's a rash of, it's going to be a strong word. But there's a number of Russian projects that are under development around the world. South Korea has stopped doing new construction for a couple of reasons. It was mainly around the response to Fukushima and domestic political opposition. It's a large industry. They both have a lot of political sway, but then also cost the government a lot of money. I don't know much about the internals of South Korean politics, but I know that mainly the decision was around Fukushima. So kind of short story is nuclear is incredibly expensive in the US. It's very expensive in Europe. But that doesn't, have to be the case. Nuclear plants have been built even in the modern era for significantly less. So there's a great paper, I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but the author is Jessica Lovering. And I'm sure I can send out some of the references that I'm talking about here afterward. And so Vogtle and Summer actually didn't make it onto this plot because it was written, before we had a little more certainty on cost numbers, but they're going to end up somewhere up there north of $11 a watt installed. There's a really interesting thing about $2 a watt. So there was an analysis done by Google, I want to say like 2 or 3 years ago, looking at different system costs of energy. And they said, if you could build a nuclear power plant for $2 a watt, it's cheaper than natural gas today. Like, not cheaper than building a new natural gas plant, but you would, if someone was responsible for the entire grid and all of its energy costs, if you could build a nuclear power plant for $2 a watt, you should turn off an existing natural gas plant and build a nuclear plant. No one's really been able to do that except South Korea. In South Korea, where they own the regulatory authority, all of the labor, all of the heavy manufacturing in country, and they actually have been able to do $2 a watt. So it's sort of like a, and South Korea trying to do that in UAE started at about $4 a watt and has crept up to about $5. It's probably a little bit more than that, since I don't think they're being totally transparent about costs. The European reactors that are under construction, the EPRs, they're going to come in like $6, $7 a watt. So $5.50 a watt, if I recall correctly, is the price point at which it makes sense in general. So $5.50 a watt, that means that, like, sure, you build the power plant, and when a natural gas plant reaches end of life, it's cost effective to replace it, or solar plus batteries, or however else you would want to try and solve that. It's like $5.50 a watt, but $2 a watt is this cool point where it actually makes sense to like stop a natural gas plant that was just built. Anyway, so how do we do better? I think there's a lot of people who've looked at the domestic industry and looked at international industry and said, like, what do you really need to do? It's standardization. Standardization is super hard when everyone says, hey, why would we standardize something we designed in the 80s, right? Like, let's design it now, and that's really awesome. But then it's new and it needs to have changes. And multi-unit builds is also a big thing. So one of the reasons a lot of plants in the US are shutting down is they built infrastructure for 6 plants. They have the site security, they have the cooling towers, they have these giant pumps that were designed to run 6 plants, and then 1 or 2 got built. And so just the cost didn't scale with the amount of power they were able to sell. So doing multi-unit builds, and that's why basically everywhere China has built a power plant is at least 6 reactors, if not 8 or 12. And then regulatory stability. So I think, honestly, the Part 52 licensing that went in place for Vogtle and Summer was probably a good thing. That's like the new licensing paradigm. It changed everything. It was going to make it super simple. But then, because no one had gone through it before, they made all these mistakes. And they were like, well, we signed a contract that the rebar would be 34.2 inches apart from each other. And it's like, well, now you didn't measure that. It's like, we didn't think we had to measure that. So all kinds of problems with that. But basically, keeping that regulatory process consistent helps keep costs low. Problem is, again, we haven't done nuclear a ton well. And so, like, regulatory stability is traded against, like, well, we're going to do it the old shitty way. But I think most of all, like, if we, kind of go back to what the preceding National Academy of Sciences said, and we think about all of this stuff, the most important thing is thinking about the big picture. It's not about, like, one power plant. Really, when we're talking about decarbonizing the grid, we can't think about decarbonizing one power plant or one transmission interconnection. We have to think about decarbonizing the grid, and over an entire year or over multiple years. That's where nuclear, that's where a lot of these other technologies as well, like wave energy or offshore wind, really have, like, more value than the power they produce. Is the synchrony of that power, is the timing of that power. And thinking about that gets you to why nuclear is needed, not thinking about what's the cheapest way to make average power over a year, because solar panels have shown that that's, like, a really cheap way to make average power over a year if you don't care when it happens. But so thinking about the big picture, thinking about how we design, incentivize, invest in systems and not components. So the system as a whole, not the components of it. Cool. So that's, like, everything up to here has been, like, my approximation of every YouTube talk about why we need nuclear. So I'm gonna pause there for, like, let's see, we're at 30 minutes. What did we schedule this for? Well, I think people's attention spans are probably like an hour. So
yeah, we have 2 hours scheduled, but I think, yeah, but some of it is going to be like breakout rooms and that kind of thing. So yeah.
Got it. Well, so it gets more interesting from here. So and probably, like, more new. So let me just scroll through the questions really quick, unless Olga, there's anything you think I should address. Okay. Ooh, someone found the lovering paper. Thanks. Okay. I'm gonna keep going. Oh wait, someone sent me a private message saying this is awesome. Aw, thanks. Cool. Okay, I'm gonna keep going then. So who here, by show of hands, knows how a nuclear reactor works? Especially people on the phone. Okay, I would say show of hands. So this used to be my old slide, and then I gave a talk about Chernobyl, which is on YouTube, and I think is really good. So I now have this slide, which is about how the Chernobyl reactor works, which has animation, which I think is just better. So basically all thermal power plants work pretty much the same way. It's just how the heat's generated. So this is how the RBMK 1000 works. So you have a pump that pump pumps water into something which makes it hot. In some types of reactors, that's the core itself. In other types of reactors, there's a loop where water is heated without boiling. It's kind of outside the point for this. So it boils, it turns to steam. That steam gets sent to a turbine. In that turbine, it expands and it cools down, and that produces energy. That energy goes to your grid to power your laptops and light bulbs right now. And then it goes back, and that's the cycle. So that's sort of, how nuclear power plants work. This is a steam power plant. I think actually steam is an interesting proxy, and I'll maybe come back to this in the Q&A, for like power plants in general and how you see them, because like some people look at steam power plants and they're like, this could be so much better. We could use these novel materials. We could use like supercritical CO2 and compress it into whatever. And then other people go like, I can buy this. This is a catalog item. Why are you reinventing the wheel? We need to go fast. So it's just sort of an interesting framing of like what we need to do for a lot of energy issues. But anyway, steam power plants. So, the big difference between thermal power plants is where the heat comes from. So in a coal plant, it's coal, and a natural gas plant, it's natural gas. Nuclear, it's fission. So I think we all understand burning, right? You light something on fire and oxidizes, and that's what produces heat. But nuclear power plant, it comes from fission. So I think most people have seen something like this somewhere. So the E equals mc squared comes from this. A neutron comes in, it hits a target nucleus. That nucleus is unstable. After it gets added a neutron, it did not want that neutron, and it splits apart. And so it splits into a couple neutrons and then some fission products. The energy from those fission products is E equals mc squared. So if you add up everything on the right, the 3 neutrons, the 2 fission products, they weigh less than all of the stuff on the left. And that difference in mass, that very tiny difference in mass, is E equals mc squared. C is a very big number. And that's sort of where the energy comes from. And that energy goes into those fission products in terms of kinetic energy. So they leave this thing going like a reasonable fraction of the speed of light, and they're heavy. And they hit things and slow down, and that's what generates heat. And that's where the power, in the energy context of a nuclear power plant comes from. Most of the energy does not go into the neutrons, whatever. And then that sort of leads to like the energy density. You're literally converting mass into energy. So just like, interesting fact you might not know, the products of a flame weigh less than the stuff before it burned also. It's just the difference is like, so here's this XKCD plot about the energy density. So it's the fuel energy density in megajoules per kilogram. You have sugar, coal, fat, gasoline, and then uranium, like stack of paper, because it's really just a lot more. But interestingly, the energy density of power plants is kind of inverted. So a nuclear power plant per cubic meter doesn't produce more energy than a natural gas plant per cubic meter of power plant. If you don't include the like fuel and the waste and whatever, just like the actual footprint of the plant itself and the buildings. So it's really about all the structures that are containing that heat that makes it really expensive, right? That volume has to be paid for. Anyway, fun little tidbit. So here's my animated version of the slide. So just to understand a little bit more about what's going on in a nuclear reactor. So this is like the chain reaction version, but if you did this, the time between these successive generations is 0.0001 seconds on average. So if you had one neutron hit one thing here, one uranium nucleus here, and then you had this chain reaction go, in about 1 second, your power has increased by 2,000,000%. That's obviously very bad. That's very similar to what happened to Chernobyl. You can't control that, right? You started 0 power, you have to get up to full power. And if your doubling time is 0.0001 seconds, it's just too fast to control. And so, people talk about reactors being critical and supercritical and subcritical. That just means like, is the population going up or down? So this is very supercritical. It's doubling, right? P1, P2, P4, P8. Supercritical. On the other hand, if for whatever reason these neutrons don't hit something, there's not as much fuel in the reactor, there's control rods, then you get a 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. That's critical. It's stable. And if that population was going down, then it's subcritical. The thing that's like a side note for those of you interested in physics, that makes reactors controllable is what's called delayed neutrons. So those fission products that I talked about before, they don't just produce heat. Some of them decay, a very, very small percentage of them decay and produce neutrons. And they do this on an order of seconds to minutes later. So now you can make your reactor supercritical, right? So actually, I didn't update the bottom, dang it. This reactor is supercritical, but instead of being supercritical with a period of, a fraction of a second, it's like a period of a minute. So you can have this very gradual, coming up in power that's very controllable, and that's what leads it to being controllable. I'm not going to go through all of these. These are like I borrowed from my Chernobyl slides because they're cool, and we would probably spend the next 8 to 12 hours. Or if you guys want to get a PhD, there's 19 programs around the country that are currently accepting PhD students for nuclear physics. But if you don't want to do that, I'm just going to go through this kind of quickly. But there's 5 general factors that people talk about from reactivity, which is how that population changes from positive to negative. So is it growing? Is it staying constant? Or is it going down? It's the balance of these 5 factors plus like 14 more, but mainly these 5. So that's, are there control rods in the reactor? Is there coolant voids? I'll talk about that in a second. Is there xenon? Is there moderation? I'll talk about, and then the fuel temperature. These are the 5 things that if you guys saw Chernobyl, these were the 5 things on his cards. Okay, so this is a slide that they would show in a nuclear engineering class to talk about neutrons slowing down. But I found that this slide doesn't go over as well with like people who don't have a physics background. I'm just going to briefly just say what's happening here. So this green this green plot is the energy spectrum of neutrons in a reactor. And so, but they're born in this corner. So neutrons come out, they're going super fast. And then they're born on the left side. You know what? I'm just going to jump forward for the sake of time. This is the whatever. Stop. This is the emoji version of that slide. So neutrons are born fast. They're flying around and they bounce off of things, and that allows them to slow down. And they keep ping-ponging off stuff. And if they manage to avoid water, which is a poison, and they avoid the uranium resonance regions, and they avoid the control rods, then they get old and slow, and they can finally reach a pace of life where they can have 2 new baby neutrons, and those fly off and keep the chain reaction going. I had a lot of flights at one point, and I just like spent the entire time making very involved PowerPoint animations. So Xenon Poisoning is, again, one I'm probably not going to go through in as much detail, but this basically is one of the really fundamental challenges with why nuclear power plants don't change power very quickly. So basically, when a neutron fissions, it instantly creates something called iodine. So iodine is an isotope, and iodine decays into xenon. Xenon decays by itself. But the interesting thing is that both of these things are neutron poisons, and they just have different timescales. So what that means is the amount of iodine in the reactor depends on the power before. So if you were running at 100% constant power, you'll reach the steady state between the 2 things, between the 2 isotopes. But the amount of xenon that's disappearing depends on your power right now. And so if you drop in power, sorry if that was, yeah. So if you're operating at steady state and you try and go up in power, you suddenly start producing a lot more xenon. I'm skipping the slide. I can't go through it too quickly. Xenon, iodine, time constants. Let's keep moving. I'm going to talk about negative feedbacks really quickly as well. This is what happened in Chernobyl. So something happens to increase power. This is what didn't happen in Chernobyl. This is what was supposed to happen in Chernobyl. So that causes an increase in boiling, which leads to voids. Very briefly, voids are places where water absorbs neutrons. If there's a void, there is no water, and so the neutron doesn't get absorbed. Just understand that. And there's more boiling, there's more voids. That leads to more power. That leads to decreased xenon concentration. So what I was going to go to on the last slide is that xenon is a neutron absorber. The more xenon there is, the less reactions there are. God, I really want to do this in like 4 hours, but we'll just keep moving.
You can take a little bit more time if you want. Like we do have 2 hours, so it doesn't have to end right at noon.
Oh, that's true. I need a breath. I haven't given the slides in a little bit. Okay, I want to take my time going through this slide. Is everyone on board with that? Okay. Whew. So if any of you have ever studied differential equations, this is like a very common, the rabbit and the hare thing, right? Or the rabbit and the fox populations, right? So the more foxes there are, the fewer rabbits there are. But then the rabbits die, and then the foxes can't eat, right? Anyone ever seen that thing before? So it's like this is the second first order differential equation coupled series that people will talk about. Okay, so here's what happens. When a uranium fission, it creates iodine. Iodine and xenon are both neutron poisons, but xenon is a much, much stronger neutron poison. So if you're running at steady state, so let's like look at this 100% power curve. This is the xenon concentration, right? If you're running at steady state, you produced iodine for a while, and that iodine has been decaying into xenon. So you have this like steady state iodine level, the steady state xenon level. The power itself is instantaneously destroying the xenon, right? So you have a neutron fission that produces a neutron. That if that neutron hits a xenon, it's captured, the xenon goes away, right? So you have the steady state balance of you have iodine being created over about 6-hour period, and then it's instantly being destroyed. And where those two things reach a balance, that's your power level. And this like makes reactors very stable, because if your power goes up, your power will go down essentially, and it tries to level it off. So the power going up will cause the xenon. Man, am I explaining this backwards? Wow, I'm so sorry, everyone. I should be more on top of this. But is anyone following this? Yeah?
I'd say about 50% for me.
Oh man, it's like, it's both tough without the like feedback of hearing people nod. Yeah, sorry about that. But basically what happens is if you drop the reactor power down, right? So let's say you're at steady state and you drop the reactor power down, all of a sudden you're not destroying xenon anymore. And so that xenon will start to rise, right? That xenon rise can actually have a runaway negative effect, because it will push your power level down further, because this iodine keeps creating xenon. Even though you're not producing power anymore, the iodine keeps creating xenon, and that xenon wants to push your power level lower and lower and lower. So in this reactor, what's like shown on this plot on the bottom, there's like control rods. There's something else compensating. So it's a negative feedback loop, because if you increase power, it is a strong negative feedback loop. But for some reason, I'm explaining something wrong, and even I am confused. Man, that's really embarrassing. I'm going to keep moving.
Yeah, don't worry about it. We can go back to this particular part. I know you have a lot more content.
I feel like I've let all of you down. You came to hear a nuclear physics, so explain nuclear physics, and you failed at explaining the nuclear physics.
Well, but I think the basic part of this set of slides, right, is that there's some positive feedback loops and some negative feedback loops, and some of them are easier to control in a particular equilibrium state, and some of them make them run away, right? And xenon is
stable, but it causes a negative runaway, essentially, if you can't compensate for it in terms of shutting the reactor down. In the sense that, like, basically this is used to explain xenon pit, which is why reactors don't load follow. So I'll just explain it from the non-physics context. So let's say the sun comes up and all the solar power plants turn on, and you say, now my nuclear reactor, it was sitting at 100%. I'd love to go down to 0%, right? So I say, okay, great, no problem. Any reactor can do that. I can drop the reactor down, and then I have to pull control rods out to try and compensate, but like I can go down to 0. The problem is when I've gone down to 50% power, my xenon starts to creep up and up and up. And now this xenon is holding the reactor shut down. The xenon that builds up when the reactor goes to low power can be stronger than the control rods. And so you could try and pull your control rods all the way out, but the xenon will hold you down. That's called the xenon pit. Until the xenon decays by itself with a 9-hour half-life, you can't add enough reactivity to the core to become critical again. Trying to fix this is what led to Chernobyl. And so there's a lot of safety controls in current nuclear power plants that basically prevent them from pulling all of their control rods out. Because once you get, if you're in a, okay, now I understand. Sorry, thanks for talking through this with me. You can get into, if just xenon is a large enough effect, you absolutely get into a positive feedback loop. And so xenon, by regulation and by design, has to be a much smaller part than your other feedback loops. So the size of the xenon term has to be much, much smaller than usually thermal feedback from the fuel, which I didn't really explain. That was the point of the bouncing ping pong ball slide. So this is a positive feedback loop. And if you let this one get too large, then you do have a runaway reactor. And so you can't do that, which is why essentially to keep this part small, you can't have a very fast changing reactor because all of the other negative feedbacks are much more stable. And they prevent you from like changing your power radically with the sun coming out. One way to get around that is to have your control rod feedback be really large. But that means you need really expensive control rods and your reactor becomes very fuel inefficient. So like, I'm gonna just pause there. That's like a really important point that people miss, I think, when they talk about, oh, like how do we make reactors integrate better with renewables? We'll make them load follow better. It's not just a safety concern that they don't load follow better, it's a cost concern. You have to have a more expensive control rod and your fuel becomes less efficient for reasons I didn't explain. To basically still be able to control around the xenon pit, or you have to use a crazy other type of reactor, which I'll talk about. Whew, I feel better about that slide now, even if only 51% of you follow it now.
Then is this picture what is sometimes referred to as delayed neutrons?
No. So delayed neutrons are, no, I have too many animations to go through all of this. Delayed neutrons are like, oh, I can click to it. Can I do that? Boom. Fancy. Delayed neutrons are this kind of thing where they come from the fission products, but this fission product is xenon, right? In this case, let's say this is iodine and xenon, right? And so over time, this iodine doesn't have a neutron decay. Iodine does not have a neutron decay, I don't think. Someone nuclear engineer in the audience, correct me if I'm wrong. But basically, some other fission product like cesium-132, I picked a number, does have a neutron decay. And so iodine goes away, becomes xenon. Cesium goes away, becomes something else, but in the process gives out a neutron. That neutron is just the same as a neutron from fission. It's actually a little better because they come out slower, which means they're like the bigger part. Doesn't matter. But yeah, that's sort of delayed neutrons. What's going on here is there's lots of things. So if we go back to this slide, like this uranium resonance, right? You can substitute anything that absorbs a neutron. It's something that can stop a neutron from going from the fast energy to the slow energy. And in the process, it like takes it out of the equation. And so you need something else to compensate for it to keep your power constant. So that's what iodine and xenon do. And now I'll explain this slide, which I couldn't explain without doing the xenon slide before. So something happens to increase your power level. That leads to increase, forget the boiling thing. That leads to xenon. And this would, if there wasn't some stronger effect, lead to a runaway. But because the fuel gets hotter and because your control rods move, you actually keep very stable. So these two things are stable terms, and the xenon is an unstable term. And so if your stable terms are much larger than your unstable terms, it doesn't matter that you have the unstable term. And what happened in Chernobyl, just whatever. I had this slide done before episode 5 of Chernobyl came out, and he had like the same colors. He had the same framing, and I was like, dang, no one's gonna wanna come to hear me talk about stuff, right? And so the fuel gets hotter, control rods move, but in Chernobyl, the fuel like was actually cold because they'd been running at really low power, and the control rods were all the way out. So they like really didn't have either of those feedbacks, and instead the xenon led to a positive runaway, which led to increased boiling, decreased xenon. I'm not gonna explain this slide, but I love this animation. So this is like a neutron being born and it gets absorbed in the water. And as more heat goes in, you start forming boiling. But then, yeah, steam can go through it. Cool animation. I'm going to skip decay heat. And then, just since you're listening, I'm going to talk about radiation versus radioactive material. So a radioactive atom emits radiation. So radiation does not make something radioactive. Caveat, if that's a neutron. So like, just, this comes up a lot. People are like, oh, you know, I was exposed to radiation. That doesn't make you radioactive. This happened in Chernobyl, in fact. Like, unless you have radioactive material on you, you are not radioactive. So that's why like you see people wearing the hazmat suits. It's not to protect them from radiation. It's to protect them from radioactive material getting stuck to them. Because radioactive material like emits radiation for a long time. It's like dose and distance and time. Or dose and time are the two things that make radiation dangerous. So it's like, it's one thing to get exposed for a second, but if you ingest something or it sticks to your clothes or whatever, then you're getting exposed for more time. So like the yellow suits don't protect you at all from radiation. They do nothing to protect you from radiation. What they protect you from is having radioactive material stick to you. Okay, in 15 minutes, I'm now going to explain the 5 different types of advanced nuclear reactors that, oh, Lambert's on the call, and Nick. Wow, I don't need to explain anything. You guys feel free to chime in whenever you know more about physics stuff than me. But as far as nuclear engineers go, I'm not a physicist. So I would trust Nick over me on the physics. Okay, so what are the type of nuclear reactors that we might build, right? If you hear someone say, we need more nuclear, like, what does that really mean? There's like discrete technologies that people have been working on since the 60s, and like pretty much they haven't changed since then. So there are 6 types. There's small modular reactors, which typically means light water small modular reactors. I'm explaining all of these. There's molten salt reactors, there's sodium fast reactors, there's gas cooled reactors, there's fluorine salt cooled high temperature reactors, and then there's basically like improved current reactors. So we're just gonna briefly like describe all of these things. So when you hear about them in the news or you hear Andrew Yang talking about thorium, you know why he's wrong. I'm so funny. Okay, so small modular reactors are, the not that advanced reactor. So small modular reactors basically says, what is the main issue with nuclear power plants? It's like the cost of capital. It's how expensive is it to get a $10 billion loan versus a $500 million loan. And so they say, okay, we'll solve all these problems with manufacturing, with construction, with whatever, by just making them smaller, right? So on the left in this picture, you can see the approximate containment size for a typical nuclear reactor versus the containment size for a small modular reactor. And then maybe you can ship something in a truck and maybe you can build it off site. But in terms of like the physics of what's going on in the reactor, they're like more or less exactly the same as large nuclear reactors. So you reduce the quantity of heat, increase surface area to volume ratio. That makes them easier to control and safer, essentially. You can simplify construction. You don't have to buy, like, how many companies in the world can roll a 4-inch thick pressure vessel is like 3. And there's like 2 of them in Japan, 1 in China, and so it's like 5. But it doesn't matter. There's not that many versus the number of places that can roll like a 1-inch thick pressure vessel because you're much smaller is in the hundreds. And so like those kind of questions of like making it smaller doesn't just make things cheaper, it also increases your supply chain, which decreases shipping costs, decreases like manufacturing costs because they don't need these specialized equipment, whatever. I would say in this race, like NuScale is the current front runner. The other 3 bullet points are really like the US companies in the race, but there's small modular reactor projects. Every country that has a nuclear program has a small modular reactor program because especially in like 2010, you couldn't go to a conference without hearing about how SMRs were going to change everything. And now it's 2020. People are still basically saying the same thing. They've obviously like moved in that decade, but we still haven't seen any SMR. I don't think anyone's really hooked one up commercially yet. But someone can feel free to chime in if that's no longer the case. Yeah, and so just like an example of what these look like, NuScale is probably the most radical SMR design. So most small modular reactors like are literally exactly the same but repackaged. NuScale, which is the current front runner, they decided to go to like a safer configuration that's less power efficient. So each one of their modules produces, I want to say 20 megawatts or 80 megawatts compared to like 240 megawatts for, say, Holtec's design, or probably it's 160 because it's Holtec 160. Empower was something like 220. So they basically are like smaller reactors that are less, they're producing less power. And so they're making that trade that if we can make it safer by producing less power, we can make it more passively safe, we can use fewer components, that we can ultimately make it cheaper. They have gotten a huge investment from the US government, they've gotten investment from private industry, they have a contract to build one from Utah's power utility, and all things indicate that they probably will build one, at least one plant, and that would be the first new build in the US, but there's definitely still things that could go wrong in that process. Thanks, Nico. So, what kind of the trades here, like a small modular reactor, the benefit, it's established technology base, license path, supply chain. So that argument of like technology challenges are well understood. I talked before about the difference between steam and something cool. That same frame fits here, right? Like, let's build what we know. Let's build components what we know with corrosion profiles that we know, water chemistry that we know, all these little things that like are hard to draw out in a diagram describing why this makes sense, or like chemistry and corrosion really, and then the whole supply chain issue. You can go to a company that makes instruments for nuclear reactors and be like, how much does this cost? What fittings do you need? All those questions like really complicate the design of advanced, novel technologies, and those don't really apply here. So it's this big supply chain, whatever. The challenge is that it's fundamentally the same tech without the same experience base. So you are changing a bunch of things at once. You're also like, while there are economies to scale, a well-built large nuclear power plant will almost certainly be cheaper than the equivalent SMR if you can build it. And that's really a reality that people are struggling with. Like, you are building more parts, it is, and you're producing less power. And so like fundamentally, there's some magic bullet you have to find to get to cheaper. And NuScale at least was targeting $6 a watt, which we talked about before. It's sort of above that price point where nuclear is like a clear where nuclear is a clear economic benefit. Yeah, and then as well, many of the costs of the nuclear build do not scale with the power level. So we talk about forward costs of nuclear power plants today, it's security. And so if the NRC doesn't change, and we, the public, don't decide that we want to change anything about security levels at nuclear power plants, if you're producing 200 megawatts or you're producing 2 gigawatts, there's not a huge difference in the security and operator costs, whatever, which is actually like what contributes to the economics of plants running forward. So there's definitely some challenges with the small reactors. So, and then there's molten salt reactors, which after like small reactors, which I think nuclear community talks about a lot, say thorium reactors and molten salt reactors specifically, or both of those, are like the thing that the public and, like literally Andrew Yang had on his energy profile, that we should build thorium reactors, which was like, cool that he's super nerdy. And then Wired, I just think this is a fun story. Wired wrote like a really good article about why thorium reactors didn't make sense. And I was like, wow, this was great. They hit all of these like very subtle technical points about thorium reactors. Good job, Wired. So, okay. What is a molten salt reactor? I think most people who've been on the internet, have been on YouTube, have like heard about this. So if you haven't, I'll just like briefly describe it. It's basically changing the paradigm of a nuclear reactor pretty radically. So instead of having solid fuel, like fuel pins that are usually like this big, solid fuel surrounded by metal cladding with water, you dissolve the fuel into something, and that something is a high temperature salt. So like table salt will melt if you get it hot enough. And some salts, so like lithium fluoride, beryllium fluoride, other fluorides or chlorides, if you're Bill Gates, am I allowed to say that? Yeah, I think that's public. Anyway, these materials will melt and you can dissolve uranium in them. And then that uranium becomes a carrier for your fuel. And so you're circulating this uranium liquid mixture through the core, and when you get it dense enough, you can have fission. And then you can produce power, and that power is carried by this molten liquid flowing around. And there's a lot of cool things about it. They have a very strong negative temperature coefficient. Because they're a liquid, the fuel expands substantially when it gets hot. And so we talked about like xenon and the positive and stable feedback effects versus the unstable feedback effects. They have very, very strong stable feedback effects. And that makes them cool. They also like can run. There's something interesting you can do when it's a liquid. Xenon that I talked about before, that unstable element is a gas. And so in a liquid reactor, so let me pause there for a second. Xenon is a gas, which means that it's not soluble in molten salt. So in a solid fuel reactor, the xenon pretty much stays in place. Like there's nowhere for it to go. So you form xenon and then you have gas in your fuel pin. There's like microscopic elements of gas. In a liquid reactor, there's no physical matrix for that gas to get trapped in. So the xenon can like bubble out and get extracted off. And that means that rather than having to wait 9 hours for the xenon to decay, you can just run a gas exchange thing and get the xenon out. And so you can run as if there's no xenon in, and so you can change your power level very quickly. And you can also run your fuel to much higher, what's called burnup. So as a solid fuel reactor runs, it accumulates all these poisons. These poisons want to shut the reactor down, and so you have to move your control rods out and out and out and out and out to compensate for that. And there's only so far you can do that while the reactor is still stable. And so eventually you say, okay, we pulled the control rods out far enough, this fuel's done. When we say it's done, it's only about 5% used. So 95% of the fuel gets left in your waste, which is like very inefficient from uranium storage standpoint. And so thorium reactors, because they can extract many of these fission products, thorium, molten salt reactors specifically, I'll talk about thorium next. Molten salt reactors specifically, because they can extract these fission products, can run to much higher utilizations of your fuel, and so they're more efficient with the fuel. So that's molten salt reactors. Thorium specifically is because you can run to these much higher burnups, you can essentially use what's called a breeding cycle, where you have so many extra neutrons flying around that you can turn thorium into uranium and then burn that. It's a very inefficient process from a neutron standpoint, which most people don't care about, but if you're a nuclear reactor, you super care about. But if you have all these extra neutrons, you can use this very inefficient process to produce more fuel online in your reactor. And so there's, pick a number with a lot of zeros, times as much thorium as uranium in the world, and it's much easier to extract. And so if we ran on a thorium cycle, everything would be great, and probably the world would be solved, and everyone would have like an Xbox in their living room. So the problem, I'll just talk about the benefits. So the benefits is there's no possibility of meltdown. Your fuel is already liquid, and people talk about drain tanks, which are probably a terrible idea, but at least sound really safe. There's very strong temperature coefficients. There's low pressure, and so like in a light water reactor, the water is under a ton of pressure, and if anything goes wrong, that pressure wants to expand, and it expands out into the countryside where people are. In a thorium reactor, there is no pressure to drive anything anywhere. And so if you did have a really bad accident, things would just pretty much stay where they are. There's no force moving it. So it might be very bad locally, but you won't have the same thing like an explosion or a plume, which can potentially change the paradigm of licensing and security and safety and whatever. Because they can convert or breathe spent fuel, they are very efficient. You can use uranium resources very effectively. They eliminate some proliferation issues in the sense that like you can use material that's harder to turn into a bomb. I'll come back to that in a second. And because they operate at much higher temperatures, they can be more efficient. I would say every one of those benefits is kind of also a con, from my perspective. So corrosion is a huge issue for thorium reactors and molten salt reactors specifically, because basically you're producing the entire periodic table of elements in a liquid next to structural materials at very high temperatures. And so like it's more or less impossible to control corrosion without ceramics, which like have their own set of issues. And so like designing heat exchangers, it's like a really good way to make heat if you just want heat in one place. But if you want to do something with that heat, you need to deal with corrosion. Circulating fuel is really hard from an operational standpoint. You have like literal tons of radioactivity and radioactive material flowing around your power plant. Maintenance becomes super hard. A lot of instruments are messed up by radiation. A lot of people can't be anywhere near the reactor. So things that you would want to go inspect, you just like literally can't. The high melting point is an operational challenge. So people usually imagine molten salt reactors like popping into existence, already running at full power, which is like really cool. But getting them to that point actually becomes super hard. And so like startup for a normal nuclear reactor is like not that interesting of a problem. But actually starting a molten salt power plant for a whole bunch of reasons is actually a huge part of the challenge. And so most of the design goes into that problem. Proliferation resistance has its ups and downs. So if you really trust people to use a molten salt reactor properly, they are more proliferation resistant. But if you trust people to use a molten salt reactor properly, you probably trust them enough to not worry about proliferation. And if you want to make a ton of really, really high quality weapons grade plutonium, number one best way to do that is a molten salt reactor. So, if you don't trust people, don't trust them. And if you do trust people, trust them. Because like, this isn't really a way, it's like, yes, it's great for avoiding proliferation, but so is people not doing it. So anyway, supply chain operational experience is immature, non-existent, right? So this is like the extreme sense of no one's really ever built these for more than a couple months to run. And like no suppliers exist for instruments, right? If you want to be like, how hot is my reactor right now? you can go for a water-cooled reactor and like buy a nuclear certified instrument that is designed to work in water up to these temperatures and pressures, and you know how much it costs, and you know where the ports need to go, right? If you're trying to design something, you say, okay, I need to figure out where my temperature sensors go. First, I need to find someone who will design a temperature sensor, and then they will build the temperature sensor, and then they will tell me how big it is, and then they'll tell me where the port goes. But until I know where the port needs to go, I need to know where what are the requirements of this temperature sensor. And it's like these really painful loops that make designing something new really hard. And just like the freeze, plug, and drain tank safety is like almost, if anyone's ever heard of this, the basic concept is you have a freeze plug at the bottom of your core, and if anything goes wrong, it passively melts and you drain into these passive cooling tanks. Cooling something down from the temperatures that molten salt reactors run at is actually not that hard, but doubling the surface area of your reactor vessel and having all this piping go along in an accident actually becomes like a much harder seismic design question than like adding the decay heat removal to the core. So I'm like not a believer that any company that actually builds a molten salt reactor, if they ever do, would use the drain tanks. So if you hear that, I don't think that's like a game changer for anything. Nick, did I say anything wrong about molten salt reactors? Or Nico? Nope. Perfect. Wow. Heart. If you guys don't know Nick Turan, by the way, if you are curious about anything I said that didn't make sense, go to whatisnuclear.com. It's a fantastic website that Nick, I think, has basically written mostly by himself and explains everything I said better with more charts, but less dynamism. So sodium fast reactors. Oh, yeah, I'm sure Nick can find that. So sodium fast reactors, I would call these like the physicist reactor. Like if you want to do everything super efficiently and really cool from a nuclear engineer standpoint, you build a sodium reactor. So sodium reactors, when I talked about the little guy flying around and the neutron slows down, and then he gets old and dies and has 2 new kids and those fly off into space, right? That's how what's called a thermal or a moderated reactor works. But you actually don't need to slow it down. And there's a bunch of really interesting things that happen if you don't try and slow your neutrons down and you just try and essentially keep them fast. And this is like where a bunch of really, I'm just gonna show this picture, a bunch of really weird physics happens that's non-intuitive. And I'm not even gonna bother trying to explain it, but suffice it to say that sort of these energy spectrums really care whether your neutrons are kind of born at this very high energy and then slow down into lower energies, or if they just stay fast all the time. So you get like more neutrons per fission, and some of your fission products don't even matter. The short summary of it is that like you need to change a whole bunch of things about your reactor. You need to basically use sodium as your coolant, or there's a couple other things you can do to run a fast reactor. You need a ton more fuel. You need like high enriched uranium or just like much higher fuel loadings to get the reactors to work at all. But it allows you to like burn fuel and do all of these cool things. So people generally, like if you went back to the peak of nuclear optimism, we're thinking more about, before I say that, benefits. I'll have this slide. This will give me a more structured framing to talk about this than like me just bouncing around all the thoughts in my head. So in general, they have better fuel utilization. So, and these things have been built. They've been built since the 50s. They tried to build one on a submarine. That was a bad idea, which I'll talk about in a second. But we've done these, like, they're pretty power dense. They use fuel super efficiently. So like, I think people, depending on how much they want to kind of imagineer the numbers, or you can like basically make this number infinite. So then it's like not really fair where you call it, but basically you can use 1,000 times less fuel in a fully closed fuel cycle, because you can use these sodium fast reactors to do that same thing that you can do with thorium and breed fuel. You can also burn waste. So because basically think of fast reactor as something that doesn't care what's in it as long as there's enough uranium, right? So like a thermal spectrum reactor, a water-cooled reactor, you have to be super careful about what you put in it. If you put like a tiny bit of extra boron in the water, the whole thing shuts down. That's really how they control the power plants, is by boronating the water. But like a sodium reactor does not care. You can put anything in the fuel, anything in the coolant, not anything, but pretty much, and it'll keep running. So you can put spent fuel, you can put material you want to breed, you can do whatever. And it's really cool. There's a lot of inherent passive safety features similar to the molten salt reactors. They are higher temperatures than light water reactors, so they can be more efficient. They're yeah, I'll just leave that there. And compared to pretty much every other type of advanced reactor, we have a ton of operating experience. So like Russia has built 3 of these at pretty much commercial levels. This is an 800 megawatt bright orange, because Russia's pretty metal. Bright orange nuclear reactor that's like a commercial power plant in Russia. I don't know if they do the same thing they did with Chernobyl with these, because you can also use them to make plutonium. You know, there's the added benefit, but in general, like those aren't used for that. Okay, so the challenge is the best coolant for a fast reactor is sodium, liquid sodium. If you guys have ever been to like a summer camp that was super nerdy, I guess that's probably didn't happen to most people, but I did. We threw sodium in a lake and it exploded. And sodium has a really cool property where if you react it with air or water, it burns. That's actually really hard when sodium is like 400 degrees Celsius, because it already wants to burn. And so sodium leaks become super problematic. All of your pipes end up being what's called double wall pipes. You have a pipe and then an inert space and then another pipe, which makes maintenance really complicated, because to work on something, you have to take off the insulation, take off the outer pipe, then you can get to the inner pipe. To quote unquote close the fuel cycle, to leverage those advantages that I talked about of like being able to use a ton less fuel, you need reprocessing. So you need to take your spent fuel and like take out the junk and take out the fuel cladding from the old reactor. And all of that stuff is like very dirty work that produces a lot of highly toxic radioactive waste, and generally is like pretty expensive, and a whole lot more expensive than not doing it at all and just mining more uranium. So that's sort of the issue with like anything people do to decrease the amount of waste ends up more expensive than what we're currently doing, which is like mining uranium and then storing it. So like sodium fast reactors solve a lot of the mining and storage problems, but right now mining and storage are not the main problems with nuclear, even though people have a lot of like legitimate issues with them. And so the economics just like don't work out. And then operational experience in the West has been really poor. So Japan and France both built large sodium reactors. France's, interestingly, got hit by an RPG. Nothing happened, but someone was like, this is really bad, I don't want this in France. And they shot an anti-tank rocket at it. And nothing happened, but whatever. And yeah, you also, to get these things to work out at commercial scale, you need like a much, much larger reactor core than a light water reactor, which makes it hard to build and the construction costs go up. Bill Gates, by the way, when he votes for what nuclear power plant, this is like his or was his vote. Yeah. Okay, next, most exciting type of nuclear reactor is gas reactors. The Germans reactor. Germans invented this. I couldn't come up with as catchy of a name as the other stuff. So gas-cooled reactors are really all about the fuel. So there's this really cool fuel that the Germans created in the, pick a number, 70s, that essentially takes the entire nuclear power plant and fits it into this like 0.5 millimeter wide ball. And so at the core, you have uranium, and then you have all of these like protective ceramic layers. And so the core philosophy of a gas-cooled reactor is you make this basically this tiny, tiny containment, and you make 1 billion of them. And then it doesn't matter what happens in the rest of your plant, because it's much more like a coal plant. No, it's much more like a very clean coal plant or something, where you're getting this heat, but there's no radioactive material spreading. You really don't, like, you have these huge safety margins. You don't have to worry about accidents to the same degree, because everything, like this stuff is basically bulletproof. You can get it up to like 2000 degrees C for short periods of time. And so you have these huge safety margins that are built into this like tiny containment dome that's surrounding your fuel. And pretty much nothing that happens out here affects what happens in here, and nothing that happens in here ever gets to out here. That's like the dream. And basically, how do you build a reactor around that? Gets a little bit complicated, but to sort of keep things as simple as possible, and from a chemical standpoint and a nuclear standpoint, most TRISO-fueled reactors are gas-cooled reactors. And so they basically say, because our safety is not dependent on the coolant, we're basically going to pretend that the coolant isn't there, and that's the easiest to do if your coolant is already barely there. And so nothing really changes much if you have like a loss of coolant, and so they use gas. So like either CO2 or nitrogen, or I don't know, what's the other one that people use? Whatever. Nitrogen, CO2, or hydrogen? Helium? Helium, that's the one. And so, yeah, you have these balls right here that have these millions of little particles in there, and those millions of particles look like that. And they're super cool. It's tri-structural isotropic fuel, TRISO. All fuel and fission products are contained at the fuel level. We've tested these in US reactors up to 1800 C with no detectable fission product released, other than silver. And we've built some of these before. So Germany, China, US, Japan have all built them. China's building one. When the US under George Bush was like, what is the nuclear power plant that we are going to build for the future? It was this thing. It's like the nuclear heat source, or NSSS. That was what we were going to use. It could be used for like process heating and whatever. So TRISO fuel leads to inherent safety and containment. You can do online refueling. So you can like have basically an automated ball pit machine that, you know, the fuel drops out the bottom and a new fuel drops in the top. And so you can get these to run for a really long time. You can get to high burnups and, you know, well, actually, you can't get to high burnups, which doesn't even matter. It's basically, you're simplifying nuclear safety. There's no coolant safety concerns. These things are generally designed to be passively safe so that, like, no matter what happens in the design basis, the fuel ball itself can withstand that, and like the reactor will just cool itself down through conduction, and conduction's always there. So that's like the dream. The challenge here is that these really mostly make sense to build with gas, except for the next thing I'll talk about. And gas is a really inefficient coolant. So you end up with these truly massive reactors, like 10 meters long by 5 or 6 meters wide, just for the core itself, which is just like, you can't ship it. You have to build it in site. It's just like, you know, the German reactor was like built out of concrete and ended up being, I think, like 15 meters in diameter, just filled with all these balls, and which makes it kind of hard to control. The design of control rods is really hard. Running with gas to just eke out that last bit of efficiency, or running to super high pressures, which does make all of your piping and your pumps really expensive. And then finally, there's only so long you can leave graphite in the core, and so like you have to basically replace the entire core or big chunks of it every like 7 to 10 years, which is, you know, a lot less than the 80 years you can get out of a light water reactor. And then lastly, there's a company in California, which no comments on, but basically they're trying to come up with a new concept. So combining some of the molten salt with some of the TRISO to maybe try and get the best of both worlds. It's probably the least mature technology in the sense that it's really like the only nuclear concept that's been explored starting in the 2000s. And so, you know, even if there's something there, there's you know, a lot more work to do on it. But there is one company in the U.S. doing this. They're Kairos Power in Alameda, California, and New Mexico. And then finally, like, there's the option of what we're currently doing today. You know, there's basically just keep doing what we're doing and make only evolutionary changes. They may not be perfect, but we work. We can design and cost and schedule around them. So that's sort of the option there. And then the last thing is, if we never do nuclear and the world again, there's always out of the world, because nuclear is a really bitchin' fuel for outer space. It's super dense. There, the energy density actually does super matter. And if we want to go to Mars, we probably need a nuclear powered rocket. And so one of the largest investors in new nuclear reactors today is NASA, developing a reactor to power our manned mission to Mars. So super cool. And I did work on that in grad school. And thank you. And then here, I'm going to show what happened at Chernobyl. I'm just going to like, and then I'll go back to questions. This was my like sweet Chernobyl power plant, which I spent like at least the flight from DC to California making. But anyway, so what happened in Chernobyl is they had all the control rods in too far, which meant that they basically didn't have enough margin on there, and they had the gap. If you guys watch Chernobyl, this made sense. I'm not going to explain Chernobyl to you right now. You've just been listening to me talk for an hour 13. Just watch the PowerPoint. Fuel got too hot. It basically dissolved. So it went from this bottom row, which you can assume is good, to this top row, which you assume is very bad. It basically vaporized the fuel, which caused the water to vaporize. But then the super hot fuel fragments also caused the fuel containment channels to fail, which caused steam to fill the containment dome, which caused a ton of pressure to happen, which caused the lid of the reactor to rip off, ripping the control rods out, which also caused all the other fuel channels to rupture, which caused their steam to flash, which caused their fuel to get super hot. Air came in, and then that was Chernobyl. Cool. Well, thanks, everyone. I guess not cool. That was like bad, but sorry.
All right, so first step, everybody unmute yourselves. Now clap vigorously. Also, also congratulations for listening to Nuclear for an hour and a half on a Sunday. And now questions. You can totally unmute yourself and just jump in if you've got any questions. Although Nick and Lambert have been doing a fantastic job answering them as we go.
Hey, I was curious about the system level challenges that you referred to that had to be solved. Can you just explain that a bit more so we who are non-physicists or entrepreneurs can better understand how to push this industry forward?
Yeah. So the system level challenges, there's sort of two perspectives of it. There's two kind of breakdowns of it. There's sort of public opposition and just people's inherent feelings about nuclear. That doesn't really have, I think, a direct impact on nuclear, but it has a very strong indirect in the sense of what our regulatory structure looks like, what our permitting process looks like. All of those things are sort of born by that societal perspective. That societal perspective is informed by a weighting that is hard to shift in the sense of what do people care about? How do people evaluate risk? And how do people evaluate the risk of climate change versus the risk of a nuclear accident? So there's that whole, that's one bin of the issue from a system level perspective is how do we get the public to think differently? But then even the tricky part is how do we get the public to think differently and then have that affect some of the institutional structures that were put in place when we had a different weighting on our values, right? If I go back to the 80s before climate change was a thing, I would probably feel differently about nuclear, and that's sort of underline how we've done our risk balance. But that's not really what I was talking about. What I was really talking about is how we value low carbon energy and how we think about the system of the energy grid. So our current structures, our current institutions for grid and utility, how utilities purchase power and whatever, essentially assume that all demand will be met, and they just try and figure out the most cost-effective way of getting there. Carbon isn't a part of the solution. And so we have terms like LCOE, lifetime cost of energy, which basically says, how do we produce an amount of energy over an amount of time? And since the grid is complicated and lots of things will feed in, and they definitely will be available, it doesn't matter the timing or what has to come in place. You really care about the amount of energy produced by a single source over an amount of time. That's a component level way of thinking about the energy grid. And that's fine for adding in small amounts of solar or having an infinite amount of pumped hydro as your backup. You can totally think about the grid that way, and it's the right way to think about the grid. That's not the case in most places, and so you need to think about, okay, I might add a more expensive source of power to the grid, and that thing makes the entire system cheaper. And that's a really there is no simple metric to capture that other than looking at data in history, essentially. You can either calculate what it was by looking back, or you can do these really complicated system level optimizations. If you Google DOSCO, D-O-S-C-O-E, Google tried to come up with a metric for this, but it basically is running on a couple supercomputers. And they're yeah, it's a cool way of looking at the system, but you can't go to an investor and say, our DOSCO is for 5.4. So does that make sense from a system perspective that nuclear is one part of a grid? And when we think about the cheapest source of energy, we need to think about the cheapest grid combination that results in that energy. So there's a Jesse Jenkins paper that's also really good. Firm low carbon energy or something, I think is generally the words in the title, that also talks about what is the grid cost from different, biomass, carbon capture, yeah.
Yeah, and just to support Ethan's point, there's a whole bunch of fun decisions that have been made, for example, that prefer one versus the other. So for example, all of the deregulated grids in the US auction based on 1 hour clearings, right? So basically, if you have a power plant, you bid into a particular hour, and here's how much I can produce energy at what price at between 2 and 3 p.m. But the fact that you bid into 1 hour at a time means that if your economics are such that you need to run for a day, there's no real way of putting that into the system.
Thank you.
What's the story of uranium mining from seawater, if you know?
Yeah, I know a little bit about it. So there are parts per billion of uranium in seawater. And you can essentially, by processing large amounts of seawater, get uranium. And there's like more uranium in seawater there is in all identified mines in the world by like a factor of 5 or 10. And so they, people have done some studies. There was one done by Japan. There was another one done by DOE to try and estimate the cost of uranium from seawater. And I'm gonna mess up the units, but it was something like $9 per kilogram or something like that. And so they said, okay, $9 per kilogram, that seems believable. Right now it's like $5.50 from mining. And so like, we don't know, there's no real point in doing uranium from seawater right now. But we know that like, that's the most expensive uranium can ever get. So it's sort of, it allowed like long-term price certainty rather than being sort of a viable like component. There's like, some issues with like the waste tailings are better. I think they're a lot better from uranium from seawater. And so there are some people pushing that, but it's hard to push something that like increase costs in a capitalist society. So that's sort of the issue there. Yeah.
Cool. So it's 12:30, and I think the way that we could kind of run the rest of this is what we do is we usually do breakout rooms for the last half an hour. And so I think some of you might be lucky enough to get paired with Ethan and
or Nick. I would definitely vote for getting paired with Nick.
Well, it's random, so it turns out that we don't control that anyways. The point is, you can continue asking questions in a more one-on-one way. For those of you that don't get paired up with the nuclear experts,
or Lambert, or Nico.
Yeah, there can be more ice-breaking questions of like just talking about your favorite technologies and this in general. And I think we're going to do 2 or 3 of them for about like 10 minutes each, so that you get to meet like different people in the community, because we have a lot of really cool expertise in the various areas of climate change, both energy and mobility and agriculture as well. So let's unmute ourselves one more time. More vigorous clapping.
Thanks for listening to this.
Thank you so much, Ethan. That was awesome. And Juliet is our Zoom fairy. So what do you think? Should we get split up into, maybe let's call it 7 or 8 groups?
Yeah, I was going to go 8 rooms because we're about 40 people, although it's dropping. So maybe we'll go 7.
All right, excellent. Yes, and let's do this for about 10 minutes, and then we'll get to meet a different set of folks.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you.
How do I do that? Oh, join breakout room 7. If Sean is still here, by the way, I'm just going to briefly answer your question. If Nick didn't. Basically, yeah, solid state. So you asked about, no, I guess, I don't know. I feel weird now because people are leaving and now people are staying to listen to me answer this question. So not that interesting. I'll leave. Join breakout room. Yeah, I mean, so I would say that like wow, what a focused room. It's like Bruce and the organizers and me.
It was random,
except for us.
Yeah, maybe I was a little hard. I'm like slightly pessimistic in general. I like very briefly touched over the topic that I left nuclear, or I left a nuclear company and I'm not working in nuclear currently. So I just have a slightly pessimistic perspective on the the state of nuclear industry in general. I think probably if it's going to be done in the U.S., like I've talked to executives at the companies building. Or I haven't talked to executives. They probably have a VP title, but it's like one of those companies with like 400 VPs. But anyway, it's like the people who have built the large nuclear power plants in the U.S. are like, we know what we did wrong. We know we would do better the second time, and goddamn, we're not doing it again. Like. Yeah. We know the crews, we would definitely do better, and there's just no way. So I think if it happens in the US, it will only be with the smaller reactors, in the sense that like they're probably price competitive with the large nuclear reactors if they're done well, or at least not that far off. And if we truly value low carbon energy, and if we truly value like the grid reliability and whatever, then like small isn't a worse way to do it. It's just not going to be that much better.
Right. But just to make a slightly different argument. So there's this really interesting set of economic graphs that basically show, and depending on the topology, that every time you build like 1,000 of something, you can drop the price by, let's call it 2x, right? So I like, these things obviously aren't perfect and like don't go to the end of time, they plateau at some point. But basically when you build a very large number of things, the price drops in ways that are hard to foresee to begin with, right? Like for example, the solar panel people at the beginning of time were probably also like, hey, we're never gonna get this below like $100 or something. So I think there is the argument of, you know, if we take the 40-year view rather than the like 20-year view, that the modular ones, because we're gonna, if they're like vaguely cost competitive, we're gonna build so many of them that the improvements are likely to be harder. So I think that there's kind of, it took me a long time to buy into these, right? Because the solar and storage people are making these kinds of arguments. And the fact that solar prices are still dropping, which is, you know, I thought that was going to stop like 3 years ago, I think really changed my mind on how much 1,000 people tweaking 1,000 things can really make a difference. So I think I'm probably a little bit more optimistic about the small module stuff if we look at like 40, 50 years, than it would be about the large ones. As cool as the large ones are, you know, they're clearly cooler or hotter, some of that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's definitely a point.
Yeah, it's like a purely it's a purely statistical point, right? It's kind of why people that don't know anything about certain technologies are sometimes better at predicting the improvements, but only in the case where you have thousands of people trying to make the improvements, because then you can make a statistical thing. So like, it's kind of like some of the solar folks that were just like, hey, look at this curve, I'm just going to extrapolate the curve, did better at predicting what's going to happen than the people that went like, how could it possibly get any cheaper? And then somebody was like, well, what if we just spray it on, right? Like,
but a lot of that requires the sort of industry to actually take a step forward and somebody be the first person to build those 1,000 reactors, right? Like if you look at solar,
you need to be the first person to build the one reactor.
Yeah, well, in this case, one reactor, but like with solar, you know, there were countries like Germany, whatever else, that paid like much higher prices to get their solar on the grid, which is what drove down the solar prices for, you know, other countries thereafter. So, I mean, who would be the people?
But you need a gazillion solar panels and a gazillion wind turbines. You only need a couple hundred or a couple thousand nuclear power plants, even small ones.
With the smaller ones, you definitely need more. I mean, sorry, less than the solar panels by like
millions, but not millions.
Yeah. But I think, and then it's always a question of like, what's that number, right? It's not always like 1,000 of them make it drop by half. Like for each technology, you have a different weird scaling. But Julia, to your point, there's usually been 3 classical ways of those people that bankroll the first drop. And it's been like governments, militaries, and oil and gas. And actually, I know this sounds super weird, but our friend Malcolm like flew over to the UAE at some point for the conference to try to convince the like Saudi and UAE like oil sheikhs that like their good long-term bet is to basically bankroll some of that. I don't think that went over really well, but I really enjoyed listening to the attempt. I
mean, the UAE is building like 4 reactors. Like, you know, it's not great. I mean, the floating nuclear power plants that Russia has built, which are like their small modular reactors essentially mounted on a barge, are entirely going to fund or to power Northern Arctic oil drilling. So, you know, it's also, I mean, that I usually say that, and then I'll say this too, because it like always makes me think of it, that the largest solar power, I think it's still the largest solar power plant in the world. I haven't checked in the last year, but anyway, the largest solar power plant in the world for a really long time was a solar thermal plant somewhere in, I think, Saudi Arabia, the Mira power plant, which was entirely used to produce steam for enhanced oil recovery.
But in fairness, like
and that's cheating because they can count thermal power instead of electricity. But
right. And for them in general, like their power usage is basically just the extraction, like as a whole. Like there's just not that many people there.
Right. So it's like
Air conditioning
yeah.
and extraction.
I had the pleasure to sit in on a talk by somebody who was working on energy storage for solar, battery storage for solar. And the thing that kept him up at night was how we don't have any market forces at play for buying power at night, and how it doesn't actually act as a market, as a free market system, because you can't shut these things down. They're baseload systems. And whereas the most expensive power should be at night when there's no solar and there's less wind, it's not. It's actually the cheapest time to buy power. That's when you charge your Tesla, which means you're charging it the most dirty you can. But because
actually, when was that talk? Because that changed. Like in California, they shifted the rate schedule.
Yes. When is that?
I thought it was like 8 months ago, 6 months ago. Yeah, so now it's cheaper to charge your Tesla in the middle of the day than at night.
The duck curve finally hit that like.
But it's not just nuclear plants, it's also combined cycle natural gas too.
Sure. Well, so in that world where, I mean, it may be slightly cheaper during the day now, but it's still super cheap, non-markets cheap to be able to, like, most of these plants are producing power less than what it takes to run the plant, just because they need to have some input of money for their services below the cost of production. In that world, is it possible to build nuclear plants? At least not the giant regular style light water reactors?
Yeah. So I mean, nuclear in general has two issues with load following. There's a technical issue and a economics issue. So for both, like, nuclear makes sense because it has really low fuel costs. Right. It's a huge amount of power for no fuel cost, right? Like fuel cost is like 2% of the cost of a power plant versus like 90% of the operating cost of a gas plant. So you don't have marginal operating costs with production. So all of your costs are fixed costs. It's capital repayment, security, staff, maintenance, whatever, which really actually probably goes up with load varying since you're cycling things, and that typically leads to faster maintenance. So from an economic side, it's really hard to do load following. The issue, and then from the technology side, it's also hard in the sense of that's solvable, right? You can make nuclear plants that load follow, but then they become more expensive, and it goes back to becoming an economics issue. It's the plant got more expensive and it makes less money, generally a bad economic driver. Yep. I think nuclear does make sense because nuclear makes sense in that world because that world doesn't make sense, right? If you want your grid to make sense, then nuclear makes sense. And what I mean by that is in the world you're describing a world with a lot of single cycle natural gas plants. Because that's what allows you to have those really fast ramp rates at relatively low cost, while still having basically super peaky and non-stable power usage. So if you find some way to either have really large demand variation or really large grid storage, you don't need those single cycle natural gas plants, but you also could then use a more stable energy input because it actually decreases the amount of storage. That makes sense?
Yeah, and Tim, I think the other thing is it really depends on how you design your wholesale energy auctioning. So for example, if it's 1 hour bidding in, which is about half of the US, right? Only half of the US is deregulated CAISO. There's a whole bunch of other ones that do completely integrated power planning, right? And they don't do hourly auctions. But if you've got hourly auctions, then the kind of systems and economics you can have in place are just much more limited. So I think people are trying to fix it by having an ability to bid into the multi-hour. So for example, I will only produce power between 2 and 3 p.m. if you also schedule me for the next 24 hours. And so once we do that, I think the optimization becomes a lot different.
But fundamentally, you still need some way of balancing variable power if you want to have a lot of variable power on the grid. If your answer is not going to be single cycle natural gas, then it needs to be something, and that something would also work with nuclear. I guess that's the thread of my answer.
Yeah, or if you design it badly, then you basically end up with some super expensive storage that's trying to do arbitrage between the like cheap and expensive stuff and modwall everything.
Right, which also works, right? You could build $40 trillion worth of batteries, assuming you could find the lithium mines, and that is a way of like,
yeah,
you know, essentially flattening your power usage.
Yeah, it's just you end up getting locked into a more expensive overall system by optimizing for the cheapest at every hour, which is super weird, but.
But my question was just, what nuclear makes sense in the world that we've got, which is we need less baseload, more peak, with the strange input sources we have. It sounds to me like large nuclear plants aren't being built in the U.S., and it sounds like that might be a big part of the reason, right?
Yeah, I mean, so like Switzerland and France work today because they have this very symbiotic, like pumped, like, I can't tell the story in 13 seconds, but that's where it works. If you have a ton of storage, right? It doesn't work in the US, like because of the reality of super cheap, it's like free solar or super cheap natural gas.
Right.
1 second.
All right.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, welcome back.
Hello.
All right, what do you guys think? Should we do another one or two of these? Did it go well?
Of course, it's so much fun.
Excellent.
Me too.
Seeing people nodding.
Also,
All right,
good to see you, Alia. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, totally. So glad you could make it. And I guess we could, it's easier to make it now over Zoom. Don't have to commute to the Bay Area.
It's pretty great. I was really not looking forward to the drive from Park City.
I have a question. I'm familiar with the group, but I am not an avid Facebooker. Is there another way to connect with future events?
Yes, there is a Google group as well, which is basically email. Do you have my email?
Okay, bye. I'm going to another breakout room, apparently.
Excellent. Okay, for whoever has a question, please email me and I'll send you the invite to the Google group.
Okay. What's your email? What?
OIRZAK. So
Okay.
oirzak@gmail.
Yep. Okay, cool.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yes, totally. See you guys in the breakouts.
Yeah, it's special down there. It's a bit different, all right. It's good fun.
Yeah.
You guys should see what Juliet did.
Nah, stop it.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
She's been painting the woodpecker that's
Hello.
at her window.
Oh, nice.
Wow.
I always paint when I'm on Zoom calls. It's like the only way I can actually focus.
Big art kit of watercolor.
How did everyone like it?
Cool.
That was...
Deech, where are you from?
I'm from
And
Seattle. Yeah, Seattle.
Oh, that's close by. I'm in Vancouver.
Oh yeah, not so far away. Cool. Yeah, I'm friends with Olya. I just joined in because I thought nuclear. I just want to learn a bit about thorium reactors, really. That was it.
Sounds like they're tough. My takeaway from that.
Yeah.
What's your
Sounds like they
background,
haven't
Deech?
solved them.
Sorry?
I'm not sure I totally understand the problems with it. Apart from there's corrosion and I don't know why. But yeah.
It's super high temperature and it generates the entire periodic table of elements all at once. And so you have every single thing that could be a corrosion input in a very, 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 very high temperature sludge.
Okay. Got it. So like the fuel is the thorium, and then you bombard it with fast neutrons, and it just turns into everything, and that everything will react with something. Is that essentially the problem? Okay.
And your moderator is salt, which is not necessarily a great.
It rots anything metal, basically. I think.
So
when you say motivator, does that mean it surrounds the fuel pellet or the fuel rod?
So that means that it's the it's everything is in a salt pellet as you put it in,
Okay.
and then you, if I remember correctly, because it's been a long time since I studied it, but and then once it starts to go critical, once you add enough heat to it, and it generates its own heat, and it actually goes critical, it turns into a molten salt. And part of the key is if you take out, if something goes wrong, and it gets too hot, you can design it where a plug melts and it drops into a lower container where it just solidifies and stops. So part of the major benefit is that you could make it self-stable and with a thing that can't go critical, which is a great advantage. But it sounds like the whole idea of even containing the whole reaction to begin with sounds particularly difficult, since you have to use, he mentioned ceramics, and they have their own load of problems, which I know nothing about. So
no worries.
That was the one technology that had some limitations on the ability to proliferate them, right, into nuclear weapons.
Yeah, he said, it was funny how he's like, oh yeah, and every one of these pros is also a con. I don't know how that one's a con, but.
I think he said that the thing was that the same unit you could use for basically making plutonium.
Ah.
That's so, on the one hand, it's not like generating plutonium, but it's a pretty handy thing to have if you need some plutonium.
Yeah, breeder reactors, I think, are generally used to make yourself plutonium, which, I mean, sounds bad, but plutonium is how we power our robots on Mars. I'm down for plutonium batteries.
Yeah. I don't think they're worried about people going to Mars, though.
I know, but
it would be a good worry to have.
Wouldn't humanity be better if that was the only thing we use plutonium for?
Yeah. So, I mean,
what are your conclusions from this exposition of different technologies in the future? What do you think about the mix in energy over the next 30, 40 years?
What do you think?
I do not have an answer to that question.
I liked the small modular reactors as a going forward for the US. They sounded pretty great, and I like that you could ramp them up and down a little bit better because they're a little less efficient, but you could use them as a replacement for peaker plants. And then you could also reprocess all the fuel with the, was it a fast reactor specifically, as a fast breeder reactor? I like that. It's sad that only Russia and a couple other places have done them, but it's good that other places have done them.
Do you think some kind of changes in tax systems or whatever, or changes in the game theory of the economy might make reburning the old rest fuels economically viable? Because the problem there is not that it's not technically possible, but it's not cost effective in the current system.
And that's that plus the size and the actual containment of fuel, of spent fuel, is always the people always talk about nuclear spent fuel as the biggest problem of nuclear, but I think that's the best part about it. As he mentioned, you're breathing in the spent fuel for every other type of plant you've got, or every coal and every natural gas. And if you look at what you try to do when you process, you do clean coal and you pull out pollutants from it from the smokestack. We've had disasters in my hometown of from Duke Power in North Carolina, where the sludge ponds from that leftover bit just breaks and goes into a stream and kills miles and miles and miles of stuff. And it's actually radioactive too, believe it or not, because anything that hot burnt that for that long produces quite a bit of radioactivity. So you have this radioactive death sludge topping ponds and the streams. Coal is far worse and produces way more radiation, kills trillions more people than nuclear does. But we fixate on something small. And so yeah.
What did you guys take away as the kind of biggest barrier to greater nuclear deployment at the moment, from that talk, or your own opinion if you already had one?
I wonder if it's consensus. I mean, do you need the industry and regulations and investors all saying, okay, this is the kind of technology we're going on, and then we develop a system that works for it because we can't develop them all together. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and then I don't think it helps that we have problems with Fukushima Daiichi and Fukushima Island and other visible problems, which are real problems, but also shouldn't mean the death knell of progress forward and lowering the carbon amounts that pollute our atmosphere. I loved his point about the if we replaced everything with coal plants, peaker plants, and we replaced all of our nuclear plants, we would be generating how many more megatons of CO2 every year. And that's for natural gas, which produces far less CO2 than it does water. So that was a great slide. But
for me, a recurring thing over the past witnesses meetings that I've seen is that, in some sense, the biggest bottleneck to our improving on these things is that the current market system forces decisions to be made in such a way that every time you build a new technology, it has to be cost effective from the beginning in isolation. It has to kind of fit the market interfaces that exist, and it has to be at the same time better in any moral or long-term sense, and it has to be cheaper because otherwise nobody's going to do it.
Yep.
And this is a severe restriction of the design space. And it seems to me that we need to kind of make more efforts, and that means changing institutions for better internalizing the externalities.
Yeah, only
so there's,
it's a major problem only if you don't have actual externalities taken into account for other people that are in the free market competing with you, right?
So for me, one of the most interesting things was the DOSCO measure. I'm going to have to look into that, because I think that the way that the energy mix would be distributed and we would make decisions might change if we took these things more seriously. If it's not something you can go to an investor and say, because my DOSCO value is better, you should invest in me. But you could go to a state if it decided to care about that, right? And then you could kind of have a redistribution system for financial investing in long-term bonds and whatnot that says that we as a society decided that we want to have these properties of our energy mix, and then we reallocate the money in such a way that then you have a mix of different technologies, and then each of them might not individually be better in cost effective in some way than the competitors, but together they might be a much more cost efficient system.
Can you remind us how that works again? How does the DOSCO work?
I have not looked at it yet because I heard it for the first time, but it seems to me that it is about solving, let's say, an economic optimization problem, and then deriving from that a valuation of the individual technologies. So you kind of say, again, I don't know the details because I haven't looked at it yet, but if you do, let's say, climate forecasting, or if you model the global economy and price fluctuations and so on, what you do is you assume that there's some kind of game theoretic situation over some expanded period of time, then you optimize for some kind of benefit, and then from that you can derive prices. And it seems to me that what this thing is doing, if it's running on some HPC cluster, it seems to be solving some kind of optimization problem to derive a valuation. But it's a valuation that is on societal level. It says, how much would the global energy efficiency and security and so on change if we did this? Which is very different than saying, how much can I make money by investing in this plant versus that other plant if I own that plant. So it's a different mechanism for deriving a valuation of a technology.
I like
it. That takes the global system into account.
So they're taking into account things like that the sun only shines during the day, and the wind only shines a certain proportion of the time. The wind only blows a certain proportion of the time, and all that sort of thing. I think that's what they're doing.
I tend to compare these things with like insurance companies. For insurance to make sense, there has to be some kind of higher entity that has a long planning horizon that does some kind of risks modeling,
right,
and says, I give you those individual contracts, but I'm the one who knows why this makes financial sense, and I make money out of it. And currently, this is basically the market and the state regulations. And the point is that we need to change the metrics by which we value these things. I don't know. Do you agree? That's kind of my natural tendency to think in this way, rather than on how to optimize an individual technology.
But the other side of it is you're passing on a massive cost, and you're taking the risk away from the investor, and you're passing on a massive cost to the consumers of electricity. When they're fixed with that cost.
But you could still have investors invest in that system, right? It's just the matter of how do you evaluate the
That's the problem. So we have a thing in Ireland. It's a completely different thing, but it's a little group of people, and they set up a combined heat and power plant for a group of houses about 20 years ago. Now everyone is still forced to pay into it, even though it doesn't work anymore. There's better sources like air to water or something like that, but they still have to pay into this thing because.
Oh my God, still 22 people on. This is excellent.
There's so many people. Clearly, coronavirus is the time to do large webinars.
Yeah, well, what do you guys think? Should we do one more?
Sure.
But I just want to say one thing really quick, which I think at the end, someone brought it up in the last breakout session for the 22 of you who are still here. I'm generally I'm an engineer, and I'm very pessimistic. So I think I kind of may have come across as I said everything was bad. I still think nuclear is good. I just focus on the problems.
I think you're right. Everything sucks.
Yeah, from a friend of ours that works in fission and the different fission approaches, he says basically everybody agrees.
Fusion. He works in fusion.
Sorry, fusion. He basically says, look, everybody agrees on what the set of problems are. What people disagree on is which ones are solvable and which ones aren't, which I thought was pretty good.
Yeah.
All right, shall we do another breakout session so that we can
let's do one more.
Get to know.
All right, our breakout session coming up.
Woohoo! How many should we do this time?
2 rooms? I don't know.
Maybe 4?
Let's compromise on 3.
All right. See you guys in a bit.
Okay, I'm in the room number 4.
Any questions on where to go? It's slightly less than breakout room 3, but we can do whatever we want.
Should we do a quick introduction? I know Pasha, but I don't think I know the other folks.
Who really even?
Yeah. And I remember Juliet, but I'll just start. My name is Philip, and I work at Tesla on energy stuff.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Pasha, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Pasha. I'm a software engineer at an industrial analytics startup.
My name is Yaniv. I'm a current student for international relations. I'm currently in Italy, although I used to live in the Bay Area.
Wow, coming in from far today.
Yeah, nighttime here.
I'm David. I'm a postdoc at University of Pennsylvania. We'll be starting as faculty at McGill, Mila. I work on math of machine learning and machine learning applied to climate change mitigation and adaptation. I also chair the organization Climate Change AI, which is a nonprofit or organizing machine learning community to work on climate change problems.
I'm Tim. I work in deep sea robotics, and we build a lot of lithium batteries that go to 8,000 meters below sea level or so at max. And so do a lot of robotics and batteries.
And nice. And Juliet, I work with Activate. We run several programs, including Cyclotron Road, which are about getting scientists and engineers with innovations that can impact society to kind of spin those out into companies and real products that can go out into the world. So Yeah, 1 minute intro's over. Nice job.
And thank you, Jay, if you were coordinating this.
Oh, I'm just lending my Zoom account and making sure things work. But all the credit for making speakers appear and give you interesting talks goes to Olya. So.
Awesome. What do you do with Cyclotron Red?
I run a couple of different programs. Some of it is about getting corporate, like large corporations to come in and work with our fellows. Some of it is about kind of the alumni program. I'm also a public speaking coach, so I help people in the program with getting ready for investor pitches or public appearances in some regards. So a couple of different things.
You guys have any investments in nuclear technologies, or?
I mean, well, we don't invest in the companies. We give them a bunch of money for free and no equity, FYI. But no, we don't have any nuclear ones. I'd say the kind of largest, well, I shouldn't say the largest scale. We have a couple of large scale things that could be comparable to nuclear in terms of like the impact, right? We have some people who are looking at clean cement. So, the scale of plants that you need to prove your technology out on if you're figuring out how to generate clean cement, that's pretty big. And then we have some people who work on retrofitting power plants that use anything from kind of natural gas to, just like really dirty fuels and making those basically either carbon neutral or carbon negative. So there's a couple of kind of large scale projects, but none of them are nuclear yet. Yet. What do you think the highlight of today was?
I was just really happy to understand a little bit more about some of the buzzwords that I've been hearing surrounding next-gen nuclear reactors.
And really hearing some of the negatives about all of these technologies, because people, they get really hyped, right? And if you go online and you're not a nuclear engineer, you're just like, wow, SMRs sound great, and molten salt sounds amazing, right? And you don't really think about, oh, wait, corrosion is a real problem. And
I think like everything that's in the world, and particularly things surrounding climate change, this kind of issue really teaches one to remember that if it hasn't been done, there's probably a reason for it.
Although those reasons are often like regulatory and lack of kind of government support / financial support, right? So
of course, but it's legitimately hard.
Oh yeah.
To have impact. So there's a reason we haven't fixed climate change. There's a reason for a lot of things, and you can fix the problem, but it's hard.
Yeah. One of the kind of disappointing things that the more you listen to climate change stuff, the more it starts looking like the primary levers are in fact political, right? Like this is really, the climate change really is a hearts and minds and political system problem. At least I am really unfit to solve, right? Like all of us are trying to be like, what are the technological solutions that we can apply to this political problem?
They're not completely divorced, right? Like it's not like the way that to apply technology to fix a problem is to say, okay, I'm just going to invent a magic machine, and nobody will have to make any political decisions at all. Technological solutions run along the lines of working very closely with governments and policymakers to solve many small bottlenecks using some mixture of people and science. And it's always a mixture of people and science.
I mean, so that there's small bottlenecks and there's different regulatory issues, but there's also like enormous investment from government, right, into scaling these technologies up, creating goodwill within communities, like changing the ways that they finance things. And I mean, one of the, I think, really interesting things that could happen out of the coronavirus, you know, situation is the amount of government funding that's coming out in stimulus packages that's hopefully, depending on the country, going to go towards accelerating some technologies and supporting that development. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see whether the world kind of seizes this as an opportunity to actually fund a whole bunch of different technologies that can make us more sustainable and have our growth as we recover from a global financial crisis come from the development and deployment of these types of things. But
what did you think was the highlight?
Oh God. I think probably that section around like understanding the corrosion and how that particular reactor works. The molten salt one. I don't think I'd ever heard it explained so simply before, and that was just like a really nice kind of visual explanation. So yeah, I enjoyed that.
Also really neat to hear about the xenon buildup.
Yeah.
Xenon.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Xenon.
And just how you want that being the reason why you. It being absorbed and trapped in the metal, so you just it's not something you can extract, ends up making a unstabilizing effect on your reaction, and that is the primary reason why you can't spin up and spin down a nuclear reactor quickly, and why 3 Mile Island happened. Oh no, not 3 Mile Island. Chernobyl happened. It's fascinating.
By the way. Ethan has another talk specifically on the Chernobyl reactor that is definitely on YouTube and is also interesting. If you guys were interested in that,
yeah,
or you could just watch the show Chernobyl.
I've heard it's good.
It's really good, and it actually has a pretty clear explanation in the last episode, I guess.
Yeah. The trial really explains it very well. I mean, it was a show trial, but still, they explain the physics pretty well, actually, in like very simple terms.
Nice.
I haven't watched it yet, but I think this might be one to add to our list of a next series watch. But
is it a Netflix show?
Yeah, it's I think it's
BBC, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, okay. I know that too.
Or yeah, I don't remember.
One of the things that I've heard about that is like they kind of over dramatize the deaths from like nuclear radiation poisoning and so forth. I don't know, for those of you who know enough about this topic, do you feel like that's an accurate assessment? Because like I was reading kind of critical reviews of this, and one of the things they were saying was like, hey, this is really not helping the whole like nuclear is actually pretty safe conclusion, and this is a one-off crazy thing, like seeing people's faces melt off and whatever else is like not accurate, not useful. But
I think what it highlights more, I think it depends on what lens you see it through. If you're like pro-nuclear, you probably see like all the stuff where it like sort of bashes nuclear. I think what it does well is like sort of just show how the scientists are like it's basically like sort of hubris on behalf of like the people who built it, who run it, versus like the scientists who are trying to get the right thing done. And yeah, it's just a very good example, I think, of like why you don't want politics to rule or make decisions about something like that. And ultimately, the test that they were running was like that caused this whole thing was like because they were behind, they didn't do the right retrofits, and then like the dude really wanted to get it done, to get his like ducks in a row and his green check mark, and it was just a total. It was all the wrong incentives. And so I think like that to me highlighted, I mean, if you want another reason to watch it, is like, you know, the Corona crisis right now. It's like a good example for, I think, what happens when.
As you explain that, I was like, so you mean exactly how the politicians decided to pretend this problem didn't exist for however long?
Yeah, exactly.
an interesting thing that came out of that, though, and this is something that I should ask Ethan about, is, so there was this Chernobyl explosion, which was obviously really bad, but there haven't really been meltdowns of Russian reactors since then, right? And one of the things that that Ethan pointed out is that the RBMK reactor was under a completely different regulatory regime, right? Like entirely different, and that that reactor could basically never have been built in the US in the first place.
Right.
But in the Soviet Union, they basically they figured out what they flaw. They retrofitted the existing RBMK reactors, and then it just kept on going, right? Like even the Chernobyl like one of them exploded, but then the other ones kept on running for years and possibly might still be running for all I know. And like there's like this weird path dependence here where it's possible that the reactors that they're running are actually cheaper to build, and they've now, it had like this one big flaw that forever poisoned the well in the West on that type of reactor, but it might actually
or
be,
on nuclear in general,
or on nuclear in general. But like, except for Russia keeps building them for whoever wants it, and we don't know what their cost profile is because they're doing it for also geopolitical reasons.
I mean, yeah. I mean, when you you know, my old nuclear physics professor, he like gave his parting talk when he became an emeritus, and he had like a really good analysis of like deaths per kilowatt hour generated or megawatt hour or whatever you want to do. And like nuclear is just not even on the chart. You can't recognize it because so few people died versus like coal and gas and solar, people falling off the roof installing solar, right? So,
I don't think that's quite a fair analysis to do, because the reason why people are worried is because of the variance, not because of the mean.
But even the variance is when you think like it's pretty small.
It's a long tail distribution here. Like a single really big accident in people's minds would vastly outweigh the much lower baseline.
It's just so funny because like you could make have the exact same discussion about the coronavirus, right?
Or basically anything. I mean, this is one of the fundamental problems with the way that people think. You know, you have a certainty of something statistically being much more likely that is baseline pretty terrible versus a small chance of an absolute catastrophe. We're much more likely to prepare for an asteroid than for climate change. Also because asteroid is easier to prepare for than climate change. But it's the same kind of situation, right?
There's also an element of like the accidents in the case of nuclear happen very quote unquote close to home, right? Because you build a nuclear reactor somewhere within like a close distance to a major population center. Whereas if you think about like where the accidents for oil and gas happen, you're talking about an oil rig blowing up, you're talking about like a train somewhere derails, or like these are places, like the deaths of the people directly working on the issue in a much more remote location. And then there's the occasional oil spill that ruins everyone's beaches. But like, aside from that, a lot of those kind of bigger, flashier accidents are not things that are actually experienced and seen by regular people, so to say. So I think that's also like a big part of what's going on in the popular mind.
We had the Deepwater Horizon spill. We didn't stop using oil.
Well,
there's also a big difference in expectation. You can expect like something that is bad but occurs constantly and know how to deal with it. But when you're not expecting an event that causes a big change.
Yeah, really good point. Like the 30,000 car deaths we have every year versus corona deaths, and people are like, well, we kill people because of cars all the time,
right? Like, so the vast majority of deaths from coal, for example, are coming through particulate matter that's causing people to die early.
Yeah.
But those aren't traceable, and it's not like you can pinpoint exactly, just like with climate change at this point.
Somebody in the witnesses, actually, I think it was Jonathan Tooman, was it? Somebody was actually doing some research around this, like trying to quantify how much coal is actually killing people. And it's like crazy because of particulates.
All right.
All right. See you guys.
Am just excited to check out the nuclear reactor type work that's being done in this space, as well as all of the other efforts that can help us create a slightly brighter future. Nice to meet you all.
Cool.
So guys, what happens in a molten salt nuclear reactor when the salt, because of an accident, becomes a normal, tasty, yummy salt?
Nothing.
It starts out as that salt.
Oh really?
Oh, you mean
How
when
do
it
you pump
you're
this?
saying when it solidifies?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
In places where you don't have any heat supply.
It's actually super challenging to deal with, and most designers are really struggling to never let that happen. But of course, you have to deal with it because it will happen at some point, because that stuff always happens. But when it solidifies, it turns into this very difficult to understand state, where you don't know if there's a pocket over here that's hot, or if something's, what the temperature distribution of the thing is. And so it's just really, really hard to characterize. It goes back to what Ethan was saying about instrumentation. Once it becomes solid, the instrumentation is even more, you really don't know what's going on in there. And so there's a lot of risks with letting it solidify. Unfortunately, nuclear reactors, even when you put the control rods in, produce significant amounts of heat on their own. And so we can leverage that to help keep them fluid, even if there's a countrywide power outage.
Is that a harder or an easier problem that what solar thermal plants have, that also have various like heat transfer fluids that they don't want to solidify?
It's harder. I'm going to answer this more conclusively than you, Nick, unless you tell me that you've been not working on SFRs for a while.
I have been working on molten salt reactors.
I guess that's true. I don't know what you've been up to for the last couple months.
But go ahead.
It's much harder just because of the temperature. Like nitrate salts for solar plants melt at a much lower temperature than typically the stability of salts you need. Like it's like to operate at higher temperature means you're more stable, which means you have a higher melting, higher melting point. So to get those higher melting points, you need to have higher temperature heaters, which are more prone to breaking and require more energy input. So generally it's a similar type of problem. And you do have the fact that there's like more heat flowing around the system, but the actual systems end up being more difficult and harder to implement.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Also, like the nuclear stuff, there's a radiological hazard that doesn't exist in solar thermal, and so there's just more stuff around it. There's shielding, there's equipment, there's all sorts of. So yeah, and if something goes wrong, it's a more.
I can't find a picture of it, but so. So ice is really weird in the sense that it expands when it freezes, but most things contract when they freeze, and almost all salts are the same. So that's nice. But then actually restarting a plant that froze unexpectedly is super challenging, because if you start, like if let's say you have a really long pipe and your heaters aren't super well distributed, and you start melting a little pocket, as it freezes, it will pull more coolant in. And then if you don't remelt it super carefully, you'll basically explode your pipes. Happens in sulfur plants, but I'm trying to find a picture.
Basically you want like a resistive heater running along like the top of it.
No, you want like staged resistive heaters so that you can like start from the outside and then like basically melt in.
Got it.
And this is just one of the any of these advanced reactors are going to have problems like this. And so when you hear someone say like, "Yep, molten salt reactors solve all the problems, and the only reason we're not doing them is because Jimmy Carter shut it down," and it was all like that's false. Like the technical challenges and the engineering that has to be done to get a new type of reactor up and running is really significant. So like for decarbonizing quickly, I tend to think like, yeah, find ways to build traditional reactors quickly. And then when you start needing advanced reactors, like when you do, the only way you're ever going to run low on uranium is if you have a massive nuclear fleet. And so it's sort of a winner's problem. Once you have all that fleet, then you can start talking about being more efficient.
And then there's a need for them, right? It's like no one needs a super efficient or, you know, a breeding nuclear power plant to make more fuel for the same reason, or, you know, uranium from seawater, all this cool stuff. Like
we have light water reactors are making massive amounts of almost carbon-free energy. We know people can build them if you standardize. We've seen it dozens of times, and you can decarbonize super effectively, like France, Russia, Korea. Like it's, and they're unbelievably safe compared. You know, if you look at 4 million air pollution deaths per year from fossil compared to 4,000 deaths total from nuclear ever in this entire history, it's like not even a comparison. And so people say, oh, you need a safer reactor, but why? Like, how is this not already unbelievably safe? And so really it's in my mind, it's like a PR and a delivery problem. We have to be able to deliver light water reactors well, and we have to get people to be okay with them, not chain themselves to the fence.
One thing that a friend of ours did, and I think he actually gave a really, really tiny talk about it before this went online, was basically try to kind of be in that world of internalizing externalities. So like right now, if we had a carbon price, I don't know that it would really move the nuclear industry that much. Would he, I mean, depending how big it was, right?
Yeah,
but like
a big enough one would definitely move the needle.
Sure, yeah. There is a carbon price at which, but that aside, what he did though was look at kind of the human cost, right? So actually basically say, well, what is a human life worth? And turns out that the military and insurance companies and a bunch of other places have actually put a price on a human life, right? So let's say a human life is worth like $8 million or some random, you know, whatever number it is that he pulled out of a whole bunch of industries. And then the next question is like, okay, well, what does pollution, or we know the death rate per like terawatt hour produced for all of these different technologies. How does the world change if we then put like a tax that is like a human life tax? And then obviously in the case of coal, like redistribute some of that money to the people that live closest to the plant that have all of the like particulate issues. And that one of those things that like definitely kills coal the fastest of anything I've ever seen. But like even natural gas, right, between that and explosions and extractions is starting to look a lot less appealing. So I thought that was kind of an interesting take on that, which I hadn't seen before, which is like takes the carbon price thing, but actually has more of the effects we want, even than the pure carbon.
Is there also a something to be said for risks being amortized over a much longer time horizon? Because I feel like with global warming and air pollution, it's actualized much faster. But if we look at, this is a bad example, I think, but like Fukushima and water, contaminated water storage, and like there's some sort of time horizon by which we can contain contaminated water, but eventually that has to go back in the ocean or somewhere. And so what are the longer term consequences, and how do we calculate the cost of those? Or is that a non-issue?
I don't know. My favorite quote is something that my friend said, who he works at Google, and he was like, you know, I think we were talking about at some point, we were climbing somewhere, and he's like, you know, I don't know anything about nuclear technology. I don't know that much about climate change, but it does seem to me that whatever the problems with nuclear waste, they're smaller than retroactively terraforming Earth, which is sort of like how I tend to view things. But like storing a finite amount of material is a challenge that we will continue to get better at over time, and like radically transforming Earth is something that will continue to stay hard over time. So that's like not an answer to your question specifically, but just like where I'm coming from.
And it might also be more succinctly phrased on my part by like terraforming carbon type issues versus like radiation. And are there characteristic properties of those two things that make one significantly more irreversible than the other?
Yeah, so one thing I'd say on that is like, as we've been operating nuclear plants for the last decades, we're starting to get a better understanding of what the risk profiles from radiological hazards are. And the scientific reality is significantly different than the political and PR reality. For instance, Nuclear waste being a massive problem is something that almost everybody thinks first thing when they hear about nuclear power. Well, we don't know what to do with the waste, and so I don't support it. But then you ask, scientifically, how many people are being injured by nuclear waste in this world? And we have significant data. I mean, we have 430 reactors all making nuclear waste, and we can start to say, okay, how many people are dying? And it turns out that, the number of people who've even been injured by spent nuclear waste is like 0 in the United States. And I can't even, and in
it's
other
2
places,
divers.
Yeah, okay, 2 divers. It's very
not
near
from
0
radiation. I think they had like some weird industrial accident.
Compared to the just millions per year from other energy sources. And so we're starting to see that radiological hazards don't appear to be as much of hazards as we sort of postulated early on. And with the Fukushima water, I mean, Japan is being very Japanese about that water, but the actual dose rate numbers in that water are so astronomically low. Diluted in the ocean, I mean, it is such a tiny fraction of your natural background that it's just like ridiculous. I can't even believe that it's a concern. Like,
it's significantly less than what you get in Colorado, right? Like Colorado has like
Colorado has twice the natural background of the U.S. on average. There's places in Iran that have 10 or 30 times the natural background, and we have yet to see a negative health effect from that dose of radiation. And these doses are, you can detect a single atom decaying, and that scares people. Oh, there's radiation here. But to detect an actual negative health effect is extraordinarily challenging at low doses of radiation. And so the way I see it is that we're learning that low dose radiation is really not nearly the concern that we kind of thought it was. And so, you don't want reactors exploding all the time. And Chernobyl and Fukushima are obviously not something that you strive for or you accept. But on the other hand, compared to other ways of making energy, it's so astronomically cleaner and safer and better for the environment and lower impact and uses less materials that I think just saying, I think the balance is clear. The balance is clear. The radiological hazard turns out is much, much, much less than climate change, air pollution, and raw material and land use from other energy sources.
And I think we'll be able, on Fukushima, we'll be able to sort of determine that somewhat statistically soon, right? Like, so for example, like, Chernobyl happened, and there's kind of theories on like, is it, worse for health effect or not? But then 20 years goes by and you can see how many people died a little bit earlier compared to like a nearby place. I think Chernobyl is a little weird because like the Soviet Union was also collapsing at the time, so your control stuff is tricky. Mm-hmm. I think with Japan, again, obviously not striving for accidents, but at least the fact that it happened will in 20 years allow us to look at some of these like cumulative effects if they exist at all, because I think that's the kind of argument that I think I've been hearing. You're like, oh, well, now there's like children with thyroid problems. Like, is that a significant effect? Does that, what does that mean for their like actual lifespan? So that's something that we'll be able to see in the absence of something that is a way bigger change, like the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I think had effects that were just so much greater that you like can't tell signal from noise.
So it is, I mean, it is and it isn't. I think it'll probably be less clear than you would think, especially with low doses of radiation. Even for like the statistically tenuous cases that do imply, well, not tenuous, like the correlation between radiation dose and negative health outcomes is a low correlation in terms of dose, right? Like you need a lot of dose to get to a health outcome relative to like what you're typically exposed to. And so the doses that people get end up pretty low. And so you expect to see in general fairly small numbers. And like it's for a lot of studies that have done like population surveys, you just struggle with all of these like confounding effects. And so like, I don't know, one paper I read that I thought was pretty interesting is like, if someone lived in Fukushima prefecture before Fukushima and because of the accident, even though they maybe weren't exposed to anything, like either way, they just decided to move to Australia because they're tired of living in Japan and there was a reactor that went off there. Then they moved to Australia and then 20 years later they get cancer. The statistical contribution from eating a more red meat influenced diet living in Australia is larger than their expected like cancer risk from the radiation that they would have received. So like even looking at things like that is like harder to hard to tease out. Like, anyway.
I mean, yeah, and very few people got large doses from Fukushima. We know high dose radiation is extremely hazardous, but what we're seeing is that reactors just don't tend to give people very large doses of radiation. Even Fukushima tried a quadruple meltdown, dosed only like 1 or 2 people to the point that a death is expected with our current models.
On the point of Japanese being Japanese, one has to take into account, of course, the political history of the Second World War, which means that collective subconscious attitude towards nuclear energy is very different. On Olia's point of internalizing the externalities, could you maybe comment a bit more on this DASCO measure and how these kinds of approaches, I haven't had the time yet to look into it because you just mentioned it half an hour ago, but how these kinds of let's say simulation-based approaches to deriving more meaningful measures of value might affect the industry or not.
Yeah, unless someone else is going to take that question. I think from a grid perspective, it's hard. There is no person who owns all the financial incentives captured by something like DASCO. In a totally centralized grid with like a 20-year election cycle, someone does. It's like if the party is in power for the next 20 years and we control all power or whatever. And by the way, just vote of confidence, that's what Russia's doing. So, if we do imagine that hypothetical, we do have this.
China has a third of their new generation typically being nuclear. So I think that's another kind of long-term party in power.
So obviously confounding effects, and you don't always want to say, well, here's what Russia does, we should do that too. More just, an example of like where those interests might be aligned. There's obviously a lot of other confounding effects. So DASCO, what it can be used for here is really to design incentives properly, in the sense that like, if you know that you're, focused on like energy arbitrage on an hour-by-hour basis, and that leads to a suboptimal system, you say, okay, well, where can we explore where, like capacity payments make sense. Capacity payments, I think in general are a bad idea. That's like how PJM and a lot of the Eastern US works, but like novel funding structures or carbon pricing, you can like play with the model to see where do you want to get to. A tool like DASCO basically, I think, isn't very useful in terms of making market decisions. It's useful in terms of making policy decisions and determining what does the optimal outcome look like, and then what are the levers that we can pull to get there, rather than like using the tool directly to help influence, the markets, etc.
So there's a really interesting story I'm aware of about, maybe you have heard this in the US and Canada over the last 5 years, the frequency redistributions. So there were in the 50s and 60s, all these radio frequencies that were given to the television providers, and then there's a massive need for redistributing the frequency bands to mobile phones. So there was a 1.5 year long nationwide auction scheme that was scientifically guided, and there was like really interesting. There's faculty in our university involved in that. So you would define what is the nationwide cost benefit analysis, and then individual players would make bets, and then you would have the resolving rounds. So my question is, could we imagine like a different political scenario, which is not completely off capitalism, but not also not fully state-owned, in which we can do some kind of mechanism design for coordinating better those long-term decisions, and somehow coupling them to the market system. And by the way, there were analyses saying that because of specific choices of how this auction was designed, that it was coupled with simulations that would do coverage, and then you would exclude bids that would invalidate the whole scheme and so on. There were more than $2 billion of cost savings for the state, for the US in total, because of better global allocation of resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer in terms of like policy measures is carbon pricing, but I think it's like a super in-depth question that I'm not the best person to answer, in terms of like what those market structures are. One thing I am really good at answering is when I need lunch, and that is now. I feel very strongly about that. I don't need to give any engineering caveats, so I'm going to go eat. But it's been lovely meeting all of you. Thank you for listening to my weird voice on a Sunday for 2 hours. So
yeah, thanks so much for speaking. That was awesome. I think it's, I don't know how you, well, we can figure this out later, but however it is you feel about your slides, I think people would love to see that at least in kind of a closed group.
Sure, I don't know, maybe I'll like, I'll decide. I don't know if I have any reason to care about these slides just being like shared on a Google Drive link. So let me not answer off the top of my head, but they're probably fine. And I'll just, yeah.
All right, well, great to see everyone. I think this sounds like a good time to end. And yeah, wonderful meeting some new people and seeing.
Thanks so much, Olya and Juliet, for organizing
this. And everyone,
thank you.
This time, clap for Olya because Olya organized all of this and made this happen. So
thank you, Olya. Cheers. Thank you, everybody. And for Juliet for being our AV fairy.
Yes, thank you, Julia.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
See you guys.
Nice to meet you.
Have a great Sunday.
Thanks for letting me in.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, bye.